Hey guys, it's Jessica.
And this is Kendra, and you're listening to
Lucid Lab.
We are back for part 2.
We are, and we were supposed to do it in the same day, and we did not.
We couldn't make it. It was too long.
It was very long. We decided to take a break to eat some food, and Kendra made a remark like, don't fall asleep on me.
And she did.
And I did. I fell asleep at one point. But then when you left, I realized it was more my fault than the food, because when I went to the restroom, I sprayed some magnesium on this part of my neck.
Yeah.
I wonder if that put me to sleep too.
Probably. I also felt tired and sluggish after eating, and I'm like, I need to have energy to talk about these things.
I know.
Like, we don't want to just feel like we're slugging through. So we saved it, and now we're hanging out on a Friday afternoon to finish the Mormon Manson episode. We started with the history of the Mormon religion, and today we're going to get into the LeBarons and all the crazy wild shit that they're going to do.
I'm glad to be awake for it.
Yes. And we're having some wine because we are recording pretty close to when the presidential debate happened, and I think all of us could use wine after watching that.
I just rolled my eyes like 5 times. It's pretty horrific.
I feel like we're living in this parallel universe. This can't be our reality.
It
like
does not make sense.
I also did want to bring up right before we get into this episode, there was a law passed in Oklahoma to put the Bible in every single classroom, and they're going to teach it. And
That's so scary.
I know those of you who are Christians might think that's a good thing, but I'm going to bring up, and we're going to see it in today's episode, that holy books can be translated by whoever wants to take it, and they can pick apart different verses and use it to their advantage. And that's why it's scary to me that the Bible will be in there and teachers could be saying whatever they believe and teaching this to young, impressionable minds. It's not a good thing.
I can't even imagine. I told Kendra if that was happening here, my daughter would be out. She's not going to go.
Absolutely.
We don't know who her teacher is going to be until a couple of weeks before school starts. That's someone you don't know. And you're going to trust them to teach your kid the Bible, and they're going to interpret it in one way. Plus, you are forcing every single person to be religious.
It's not good.
What the fuck? How can you get away with that in a state, an entire state? I don't understand.
In a country where it's supposed to be freedom of religion.
And church and the state are
separate.
Supposed to be separate.
And it needs to be, because we talked about this in the first part where Brigham Young wanted to create a theocracy. And back in the 1800s, our government would not let that happen because they realized how dangerous that could be.
Yeah.
Hopefully somebody steps up and we don't end up back there, but it's scary times right now.
Really scary times. And they just overturned the Chevron doctrine, which, if you don't know what that is, essentially it's what protects us from a lot of different things.
Okay.
So like the FDA and the EPA and education, there's not like this group of experts that's going to be like, hey, you can't put asbestos in water.
Right.
We're going to fine you if you do.
So we have no oversight.
There's no oversight.
Companies are not going to do the right thing. They're not going to. The cheap thing, the profitable thing.
They're going to go dump all their shit where they're not supposed to dump their stuff. The impact of overturning that affects every bit of our everyday lives.
That's really scary.
And that's just opening it up for Project 2025.
Depending on what happens, I could see us doing an episode about Project 2025.
I know.
I don't know if you guys want those kind of episodes, but like,
I know.
I feel like we feel called to do those because of our platform, and it's just weighing heavily on us.
It is. And I would see international listeners being interested in that. What's hard is here in America, you know, you have the divided parties. And we've tried to talk to some of them, and it doesn't matter what someone does or who they are. They're going to vote that party anyway. And that's just how it's been for a really long time. And we have absolutely horrible candidates. It's a laughingstock. Everybody here knows that. Like, we're
embarrassed.
Very embarrassed. But even though we're all embarrassed, you still see that massive divide. And it's really scary. I'm really scared for my daughter's future right now.
I'm scared for women's rights and LGBTQ rights.
Yep.
Which I have people close to me that are part of that group, and it just sucks. It just sucks all around. So sorry, we're not on a more positive place right now. We are going to get into the episode now and talk about some not so great things that were done through the name of religion back in the 1970s. So let's jump back into the LeBaron family.
Because America is just a bunch of cults. That's all we are.
It's true. So when I left off, we had just gotten to the 1890 manifesto from the president of the Mormon Church, Woodruff, saying that polygamy was gone. And at that time, it led to those who felt like they wanted to stay with the true origins of Joseph Smith's teaching, which included the sacred principle of plural marriage. And so you saw a lot of sects break off at that point. And that's going to lead us to Mexico, which is where this story is going to take place for the most part. So to get to the LeBarons, it started back with a man named Benjamin Franklin Johnson, and he was an early disciple of the Mormon Church, and he was actually very close to Joseph Smith. He was his confidant, his private secretary, his bodyguard, his personal lawyer. I even read one article, which was kind of weird, saying that they were so close that Benjamin Johnson would give Joseph Smith enemas. So
okay. That seems like a wifely duty out of all the wives you have, but okay.
I didn't quite know what to make of that, but just letting you know they were that close.
Okay.
Benjamin lived in Nauvoo, which was the original colony before Joseph Smith was killed by the mob. And he met a woman there named Melissa LeBaron, and they fell in love and got married. And that's really where the whole LeBaron is going to come from, is this mix between Benjamin's lineage and Melissa's. It gets really complicated to understand how the LeBaron name, since she was the wife, would pull out. There was a lot of intermarriage between these two families. When that 1890 manifesto came out, Benjamin Johnson jumped up and was like, no, I know Joseph Smith better than anyone. I gave him enemas. And he said Joseph would be rolling over in his grave over this. And he was one of the first and most vocal to come out and say that Woodruff was a false prophet and that polygamy had to move forward.
Okay.
And he had a warrant issued for his arrest because it was illegal. And so that's when he fled. At this time, he was 72 years old.
Holy shit. Get over it then, dude. Move on.
And he took all of the LeBarons and the Johnsons, and they moved into this colony. They continued to intermarry, and it's slim pickings when it's just two families. So they were marrying first cousins to first cousins, and that was completely acceptable. So it all like stemmed down to Benjamin Johnson. He, at age 72, after this happened, stepped up and claimed that actually he was the one that Joseph Smith had appointed to be the prophet on earth, the one mighty and strong.
Of course.
I don't remember if I mentioned it in the first part, but I just want to bring up what the one mighty and strong is supposed to do, because it will be what everyone claims they are in the next couple hours of this story. Joseph Smith said this would be the one who would come and set in order the house of God and arrange for the second coming of Jesus Christ.
Okay.
And they all believed Jesus Christ was coming back during their lifetime.
Okay.
Benjamin Johnson, he was 72 years old, and he got weak and feeble, and he realized he wasn't going to see the second coming of Christ.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, he chose the firstborn son of his favorite daughter, and she was married to Benjamin LeBaron. So that's how the LeBaron name is going to carry forward.
Oh, okay.
And the name of that child was Alma Dayer LeBaron, and he was chosen to be the one mighty and strong right before Benjamin Johnson died.
Okay. Alma or Almer?
He actually goes by Dayer.
Okay.
We'll call him Dayer from now on. So these colonies, there was actually a total of 9 that were built in Mexico. 7 of them were in Chihuahua, Mexico, and 2 were in Sonora. And each one had their own little thriving town. They were able to get the land really cheap. They had already learned from living in Utah how to exist, I guess, in a really desolate desert type place.
Okay.
And they kind of coexisted among the Mexicans because they would grow food and sell back to the Mexican citizens. They would start converting some of the Mexican citizens into their colonies as well, because I guess you get tired of marrying your own first cousins at some point.
Sure.
And they would intermarry, even though that was against Joseph Smith's original teachings and Brigham Young. They felt like they were doing a favor to the Mexican citizens, which, remember, they called the Lamanites, by helping them escape the curse of Cain by having offspring that were mixed with the white Mormons. So a bunch of that going on. Come to 1912, there was a revolution going on in Mexico. And during that time, the Mexicans actually rose up against the Mormons and said, this is our land again. And they kicked the Mormons out of Mexico.
Okay.
This fed into that idea that they were the persecuted chosen ones. And at that time, Alma Dayer LeBaron came back to America and was living in Utah, and he was getting older. He had been told by his grandfather that he was the one mighty and strong, but he hadn't really been doing anything with it until he hit about 37 years old. So he was a late bloomer.
Okay.
He was only married to one woman. Her name was Maud, and she was his first cousin, and they had 8 children.
Wow.
But he was woken up one night by a visitation from his grandfather, Benjamin Johnson, and he came to him and he said, Dayer, wake up.
Do your job.
So Dayer sat up in his bed and he said he saw his grandfather seated on a throne, clothed in white robes of priesthood. In his right hand, he held a scepter of gold and had a crown with 7 shining stars resting on his head. Dayer realized that the scepter represented his grandpa's priesthood authority and that the jewels in his crown signified his 7 wives.
Okay.
He saw this as a sign, and a man with a quorum of 7 or more wives is destined for godhood. Like, this just confirmed to him that everything he had been told growing up was true because he saw his grandfather there.
So he needed 6 more wives.
Exactly. He claims he heard a voice coming out of heaven, which he assumed was God himself, and it said, "This shall be your destiny also if you abide by my law." Dayer interpreted this to mean he should begin following polygamy again, and the way to do that was to lead his people back down to Mexico because they couldn't do it in the U.S. It was illegal. So Dayer convinced his wife of 14 years that it was time for him to take on another wife. It was her responsibility to select that second wife for him.
Well, I mean, at least there's that.
At least she had choice. Interestingly enough, she chose her teenage babysitter named Oni Jones to be her sister wife. Maybe that was just out of convenience because...
I mean, maybe she's done. She had 8 children already.
She doesn't want to...
She's like, here's this pretty little thing. Now you don't have to pay attention to me anymore.
True.
Leave me alone.
And Oni was already taking care of the kids, so it was like easy to just transition
now
and say...
Now she can retire. But I mean, what are you going to say going back down to Mexico? You guys have to let us live here or I can't have 7 wives.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting conversation for sure. He married Oni in a secret ceremony, but it got out to the mainstream Mormon church and they were immediately excommunicated, and a warrant from the U.S. government was issued against Dayer.
But is he in Mexico already or no?
No.
Okay.
For whatever reason, he married this girl while he was still in Utah, which was really dumb, dude.
Yeah.
Should have waited. So it took him a few more years, and that gets us to 1924, and that's when he's going to sneak out. Like, they were hopping around to different places, hiding out with his 2 wives. I don't know. I guess he took the hard path. He should have just waited.
I know. It's because he wanted sex.
Probably.
Because
they do not believe, the Mormon religion does not believe in sex before marriage. No. So you're right.
People have gotten married for less.
True.
So.
By this time in 1924, there had been other Mormons who were wanting to practice polygamy, the fundamentalists, and they had been back down there to one of the colonies, which was Colonia Juarez. And there was about 237 Mormons already living there. So that's where the LeBarons would flee to. On the way to Mexico, Maud, so I guess he's still messing around with her, she would conceive their 9th child.
Okay.
And that 9th child will be Ervil LeBaron. Okay. And he's the one who's going to become our Mormon Manson.
Oh, wow.
The LeBarons arrived in Mexico flat broke. They only had enough money to buy 2 ramshackle houses in the Colonia Juarez community. Dayer would work odd jobs as needed in the community to try and earn a living, but he had 9 kids. It took him a while, but he did end up building a semi-successful fruit business.
Okay.
But something had changed about Colonia Juarez since Dayer had been there as a child back in the days. It used to be a complete bastion of fundamentalism, and polygamy was the way to go. But this new set of Mormons that had resettled there, they wanted to still be aligned with the mainstream Mormon church. And so they had actually abolished polygamy. But ironically, all of them were polygamists. They were like sitting from this self-righteous place that they had been grandfathered in, and that they had, been polygamists before the 1890 manifesto. So therefore, it was okay for them to continue marrying people because they had already been told that polygamy was okay if you already had wives. Remember, that was part of the 1890 manifesto. But they looked down their nose at Dayer because he married his wife after 1890, or his plural wife.
But they're allowed to keep marrying?
Yes, because they already had been polygamists.
That's ridiculous.
Obviously, this was a sticking point for Dayer. He felt like they were being very hypocritical towards him, and it led to the LeBarons being outcasts. even in colonial
okay.
Juarez. And Dayer wasn't quiet about it. He kept preaching about the traditionalist side of it and Joseph Smith and saying that he was the one mighty and strong, which everybody just started looking at him as a crazy person.
Yeah. I mean, if you weren't there when such a thing was handed down to him.
And he's coming in and saying, no, you guys are wrong. I'm actually the one. And I had this vision from my grandfather and we need to go back to the old ways. And they're like, who the fuck are you, dude?
Yeah.
The problem is that this led to his 9 children growing up as outcasts.
Okay.
So they're not seen as part of the colony and they're all kind of keeping to themselves and probably pretty embarrassed by their father.
Yeah.
It got to a boiling point because Dayer wouldn't shut up about being the one mighty and strong and that the others were living in sin or whatever. And they asked him and his family to leave Colonia Juarez. It broke Dayer's heart and his children never got over the fact that their dad was cast out from this colony. So it's going to build up that trauma within all of these boys. So they had enough money at this point to go and purchase their own land in a place called Galeana, which was in Chihuahua, Mexico, not too far away from Colonia Juarez. It was 1944 at this time. They got 50 acres. They were able to get it from the government for a really cheap price because the Mexican government was looking for people to come and build up more farms in the area. Dayer had been successful at building fruit farms and the government was like, sure, you seem like you will contribute. And they began calling that location the New Zion, and it was also called Colonia LeBaron.
Okay.
Not very creative.
No. How many Zions are there now? Just kidding.
And they've always been in like the worst places. They're not even really pretty because this is not a pretty part of Mexico. It's like all dust and scorpions.
And scorpions.
2 members of the other colonies in Mexico, they would call Colonia LeBaron the bastard child. Leaders in the U.S. would always joke about Colonia LeBaron as being the colony of the hidden saints, just kind of tongue-in-cheek, like, oh, they think they're the ones. So they ended up living in a lot of isolation. It was also rumored that because of all of their inbreeding, there was this intergenerational strain of insanity spreading within the family.
Interesting.
Which we'll see because a lot of the LeBarons are going to be diagnosed with actual mental disorders. It's scary when you have true mental disorders mixed with religious fanaticism.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a whole other layer.
So Colonia LeBaron was not an ideal place to live. There was no electricity or running water.
Oh.
And for years, they didn't even have an actual home structure. They just had the land and they were living in tents or like whatever ramshackle they could put together.
Wow.
One of Dayer's children, Lucinda, when she was 12 years old, she began suffering from some kind of mental illness that would lead to psychotic episodes.
Mm-hmm.
And the family believed that she was possessed by evil spirits instead of getting her any kind of help. And they would actually chain her up in a goat pen.
Oh.
And they said she would spend most of her time just curled up in a fetal position. So that's really sad.
Yeah.
When you just write your 12-year-old daughter off to being possessed by the devil instead of getting her help.
Yeah.
They would attract Mexican citizens to help build up their colony because most of the Mormons thought they were crazy, but they needed to, start the kingdom of God in the New Zion.
Right.
And Dayer would travel back to the States and start preaching this fundamentalist. And somehow he was able to pull in followers and people began moving to Colonia LeBaron.
Because men want extra wives.
I think that's exactly all it could be. I don't know what else would make you. He would oversell how nice Colonia LeBaron was.
Oh, of course.
And there was one daughter in one of the books I read, and she moved there with her family at a young age. She said when she got there, the poverty and the abuse from the men towards their women and children was depressing. She said they were sold the land of milk and honey. That's what Dayer LeBaron said it was. And she said, instead, my father brought his wives and children to a land of cactus, scorpions, and rattlesnakes, where there was nothing to eat except yams, and more yams.
Well, I do like some yams.
Probably not for every meal.
Not every meal.
Despite all of this, those who did travel and began living in Colonia LeBaron began considering themselves to be spiritually superior to all the other colonies because they were following Dayer. He was the one mighty and strong. Mm-hmm. And he had been given the mantle of priesthood directly from Joseph Smith through his grandfather. In 1951, Dare claimed to have yet another vision, and in that vision, he said that the Lord spoke to him directly and said that through his sons, the whole world would be blessed. So the LeBaron boys are going to grow up thinking this because he's going to preach this into their brains. The oldest son of Dare was Benjamin LeBaron, and he seemed to be the obvious successor. His father was starting to get older. Benjamin LeBaron, he was 6'2". He was quite handsome and really intelligent, actually. He was charming and charismatic.
But he only wanted to date one girl.
No. He got to about the age of 35 and he was actually kind of losing it. There was several stories. I didn't include them in here, but he got pulled over by the cops one time and he was like, "You can't pull me over. I'm the one mighty and strong," or "I'm going to be the one mighty and strong." And they were like, "What are you talking about?" And he just dropped down to the ground and started doing push-ups. And he was like,
"Oh my God.
See, I'm the prophet of God. Look how many push-ups I did." And the cops are like, "I don't understand." And he's like, "You couldn't do that many push-ups." So
oh, wow.
He's missing a few screws.
Yeah.
And he kept kind of descending into madness. And the family at some point were like, okay, maybe this guy's not going to be.
Not this one. What's next?
Although they never got help for their daughter, Lucinda, because she never recovered. She would be kept, sadly, not in the goat pen. Eventually they would move her into her own little shack house or whatever. But she was kept tied up pretty much her entire life.
Oh, wow.
They did take Benjamin to a mental hospital, and he was diagnosed at the age of 35 with both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
Okay.
He was committed to the Utah State Mental Hospital. So, yeah, he wasn't going to be the one. So that left 6 other sons to choose from. Dare was supposed to figure out which was going to be the chosen one to take the mantle of the one mighty and strong, but then he died abruptly.
Oh.
From what they believe was lead poisoning.
I think God is trying to tell you that your plan is wrong. So if you don't stop this nonsense, I'm going to take every one of them.
So the problem is he passed away. And you've got 6 boys who are told by their father that they are to bless the world, but it's not clear which one of them should be stepping into the place of the one mighty and strong. And this is going to set into motion everything else that's going to happen because they're going to become rivals over who should be that person.
Okay.
No one really stepped up right away. I don't think any of them were quite ready. In fact, 2 of the brothers, Ervil and Joel, chose instead to go and join another fundamentalist group in the area called the United Apostolic Brethren. And this was a group that was created in Arizona by a man named Rulon Allred. This was one of the larger sects at the time, and perhaps the brothers were just trying to recover the LeBaron name or find a sense of belongings. Joel even asked at that point to be reunited as a member of the mainstream Mormon church in Salt Lake City.
Oh, wow.
His father had been excommunicated, which excommunicated all of his kids as well. But I think Joel was like, that was my dad. I kind of want to find my own voice.
Yeah, they should probably let him back in.
Yeah. When they went to talk to Rulon, he allowed them to open up their own branch of the United Apostolic Brethren in Colonial LeBaron. Their oldest brother, Alma LeBaron, became the bishop, but it wouldn't really last long because at some point they get tired of following other people's rules and remember that their dad said they were the chosen ones. Maybe they should be the ones making the rules instead.
It becomes not about fitting in, but creating something
or
for themselves.
They're snapping because all of them have a little bit of insanity running in their family. Now, the LeBaron brothers, when they were younger, they're all like over 6 feet tall and they are good looking men.
Okay.
Ervil was actually described as probably being the most attractive. They said he had Hollywood good looks. The other brothers that are going to come into this story, I've already mentioned Joel and Alma. There's another one called Verlin. They have really interesting names.
Verlin.
It could get really confusing just because they're such weird names. They also had charisma. People liked them. They were smart and they knew how to get people on their side. So they were also very manipulative and they were able to preach the scriptures because while they had been outcast, they had spent so much time diving into the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith's teachings and all of that.
Okay.
So it's been 4 years now since Dare has passed away and not one of the sons has stepped forward. They've all kind of been playing it safe and staying with Rulon Allred's group. But out of the blue, Joel LeBaron, I think he was the third oldest, would just step forward. He was 32 years old, and he declared himself as the true representative of Christ on earth and began telling everyone that his father, Dare, had actually given him the title on his deathbed.
I'm sure his brothers were like, now wait a second.
Yes, they were. One of the main books that I used when researching this episode is called Cult Insanity. It is written by Irene Spencer, and she is actually the second wife to Ervil LeBaron. That was one of the other sons I mentioned earlier. So she was on the ground. She saw all of this happen, and she knew all of the brothers really well. She said that during her time living in colonial LeBaron, she would watch more than a dozen men step forward and try and claim the title of the one mighty and strong.
Oh my gosh.
She said it amazed her how every leader seemed to use the same scriptures to prove their right to wield the power over other people's lives.
And they all had visions, and they all had deathbed confessions.
So Irene Spencer had grown up in Rulon Allred's fundamentalist sect. She was like a fourth generation polygamist, so that was just part of her life. And she met Ervil LeBaron, very good looking man, and she was smitten with him. She knew he already had one wife. The first wife of Ervil was actually her older sister, Charlotte.
Oh.
So he came and married Charlotte, and she just had this like girlhood crush on Ervil. He was like 28 years old.
Yeah.
So she was only 16 years old when she married Ervil, and she actually did this against her parents' will. Her parents were absolutely devastated that she chose this path. And I think later on she's going to realize she was young and dumb to have joined this group.
And this is someone that her sister is already married to?
Yes. Also, she did not live in Mexico. She lived in the States.
Oh.
So her sister married Ervil and moved down to Mexico. And Ervil thought it would be a great idea to marry the sister because then they could keep each other company.
And sleep with the same boy.
And she talks about that. So she thinks she's going off to marry Prince Charming because she has this childhood infatuation with him. And she says she gets down to Colonial LeBaron on her wedding night. So she was married in the States, and then they swept her off to Mexico. And she said she showed up and there was a house built of like the stucco adobe.
Mm-hmm.
She said it had no electricity, no running water, dirt floors, very few furnishings. And he took her into her bedroom where she was going to stay. The bed didn't have a mattress. It was basically just strings tied together.
Yeah.
And he was like, it'll be fine once you throw a blanket on it.
Okay.
She said the only thing they ever had to eat was
yams,
whatever they grew in the garden, or beans and tortillas. She said once women were brought into the colony, they rarely ever left. They just started having children right away, and they would all help each other. She did talk about how awkward it was the first day when she walked out and saw her sister.
Yeah.
Knowing that her sister knew that she just slept with her husband. And
yeah.
But they kind of got over that because they were just happy to have each other, because this is not a great place to live. It's in squalor. And I think the women really bonded in this colony because of that. And they were all having children all the time. They were stuck there, but the men left all the time because they didn't really have a good income in Mexico. So a lot of the men that would come to Colonial LeBaron, they would go and marry all these girls and have them down there, but they would go back to the States to work a job to be able to support their family. And Ervil was no different. He was traveling frequently, so she was left there a lot with her sister. They would also go back to the States to do mission work to recruit more men to be part of the LeBaron colony. And most of these men would go and find women in the States to marry and then bring them back to Mexico. They were sold this idea of it being a really nice colony. They always married the women in the States. So by the time they got the women down there,
they wouldn't let them come visit first, because then she would say, hell no.
Yes, it was done in a very deceptive way. So Joel LeBaron has now stepped forward and said he's the one mighty and strong. He had married his first wife. It was a Mexican citizen, and he actually left Colonial LeBaron. He wanted to go and live up in the mountains near where his wife had come from. And he is riding the bus back to Colonial LeBaron, and he claims while he's on this bus, he receives another vision. He got the surprise of a lifetime because he looked next to him on the bus, and Jesus Christ himself was sitting there.
My goodness.
Jesus told him that he needed to go straight to Salt Lake City, don't tell his brothers what he's doing, and he should incorporate a new church stating himself once again as the one mighty and strong, and the church was to be called the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. Quite a mouthful.
Yeah. Wow.
So he showed up in Salt Lake City. He incorporated this church.
It sounds like the never-ending story or something.
He sent a letter to Rulon Allred, the Apostolic Brethren leader, and it read, "Thus saith the Lord, I have called my servant Joel LeBaron out of the land of Mexico, as I called my servant Moses, that through him I might deliver my people from bondage. And I call you by my own voice out of the heavens to be a counselor to my servant Joel." And there's a lot more to it that I don't like to read in that way that they write. But he essentially was saying that Rulon Allred should step aside and say that Joel is the one mighty and strong and bring all of his followers over to follow Joel LeBaron.
Can you imagine receiving that letter?
He received it and kind of just tossed it aside.
Okay.
Literally. Joel had hoped by sending this revelation and saying that it came directly from God, that Rulon Allred, who had several thousand followers at this point, would just magically start following Joel because he had this vision. Jesus Christ sat next to him on a bus. Come on, dude. Gotta be true. Instead, Rulon Allred completely ignored it.
Yeah.
He just considered it another example that the LeBaron family was insane.
They're losing it.
He was very vocal about that. Joel quickly became like a laughing stock, and then that's going to trigger all of their trauma. So while the brothers were originally upset when they heard that Joel was claiming this for his own, when Joel was kind of laughed off by Rulon, they're going to do the whole blood's thicker than water, and they're going to say, no, my dad did say Joel, even though they knew their dad did not say that Joel was the one mighty and strong, because in fact, remember, their dad was dying by lead poisoning, and he wasn't talking to anybody because in his last 2 weeks, he was basically in a coma. The brothers knew that Joel did not get this directly from their dad, but what was more important to them was that their family name was not dragged through the mud again. And so they're going to stand up and say, yeah, Joel is the one mighty and strong, at least for now.
For now, yes.
The LeBarons realized that they need to start building up more wives and their colony. And so they began taking more Mexican citizens as wives and also marrying the young daughters and nieces of the men that did come into the church. It's pretty gross. Within their sect of the church, they considered marriable age at 14.
I can't imagine being one of the women and being like, please don't be a girl. Please don't be a girl.
Always. I would never want to have a daughter into this.
But then you're also breeding
gross
men who are going to expect a bunch of young girls to marry them.
So the men are going to start building up because they feel like they need those 7 wives. Joel's first wife, I already mentioned, was Magdalena. Verlin's first wife was Charlotte, and then Irene was his second. Ervil had his first wife. Her name was Delphina, and she was also a Mexican citizen, and he got a second wife named Mary Lou, but he began feeling like he needed to have an American wife. Irene talks about this in her book, that Ervil would show up and say that he didn't want his wives because most of them didn't speak English if you married the Mexican citizens. And he was like, I need a woman who understands things in English. He actually would like flirt with Irene quite often, even though she was married to his brother.
You could like learn their language since you decided to take over their place, but you know, that's okay.
The other fucked up thing about the brothers is that they were marrying these Mexican women who came from Catholic families, and their families would marry them thinking that they were doing good for their daughters because they were white men and they thought they had more money.
Yeah.
And these girls didn't know what they were getting into because they didn't speak the language. And there were stories of when Ervil got his second wife, Mary Lou, that Delphina, his first wife, she didn't know was beside herself because that was her husband. And then he and Mary Lou was much younger. They always bring these younger girls, and they would go to this one town, the brothers would, and they would have these like festivals where everybody in the town would come out, and they would pick out these young girls and then go talk to the fathers and then bring them back to Colonial LeBaron. Some of the Mexican citizen women would like get on a bus and run away and get back to their families.
Once they figured out what it was all about.
That was more motivation for why they wanted to start getting American wives, because it's a lot harder for American girls to get out of Mexico and back to their families. And this is in a time when you couldn't really call your family and tell them what's going on. They didn't have telephones like in the colony.
So they wanted slave wives.
Kind of. They were trapped. I'll just make sure we know where we are right now. We're in 1950s. Around 1955 is when Joel stepped up and started this whole new church. People in Utah and Arizona and wherever else the Mormons were living were hearing about the LeBaron cult, I guess, or the Church of Fullness of Times, whatever the fuck it was called. And they are being drawn to it, and they want to go see who Joel is that says he's the one mighty and strong, because nobody else at this time has stepped forward and said they're a prophet on earth.
Okay.
You have people traveling to Colonial LeBaron to meet Joel and be like, is this guy really the
disappointed?
Truth? Yeah. Or Joel was traveling back to Utah, which was probably more fruitful for them because they could lie about what it looked like. But at some point, this guy named Carl Walks came from Utah, and in his car, he had a bunch of rare early Mormon books. And Ervil was drawn to those because we're going to see Ervil start wanting to gain more power. One of these books was the Journal of Discourses, and it contained sermons from the early Mormon presidents and prophets, including Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. He just became obsessed with these books, and this is when he's learning some very dangerous things that hadn't really been talked about in the last 50 years, and one of those was blood atonement.
Oh.
Which we mentioned in the first part of the episode.
Yep.
He just got real excited, and he was seeing all of the reasons on why people could be blood atoned. Those offenses included leaving the church, adultery, or just immorality in general. This is where I say it gets dangerous when people can make their decisions for themselves. Covenant breakers, stealing, taking the Lord's name in vain.
That was one thing I grew up with.
Yeah, I did too.
We still get it today from random people on the internet because of our episode.
I know. Marrying a black person was considered a reason you could be blood atoned.
Oh, wow.
Counterfeiting, I don't really know what that covers, and apostasy. Ervil had a long list of things he could start judging others by now, and Ervil began believing that he had been given this stash of books from some divine way.
And now he is the one.
And he began standing in the pulpit within Colonial LeBaron and preaching about the death penalty. He claimed that he had been designated as God's avenger and began using these books kind of as a license to kill in the name of God.
Uh-oh.
He became obsessed with weeding out the wicked and preparing a perfect society that would be prepared to meet the Savior, Jesus Christ himself, on his second coming. Ervil was more vocal. I should have mentioned Joel was kind of more soft-spoken, more humble kind of guy. At this point, he was leaning on his brothers quite heavily. He had put Alma up as the bishop, and he appointed Ervil as the patriarch of the church. And he would defer to Ervil quite often to interpret the scriptures and give the sermons, because I think it just wasn't one of Joel's talents. Around this time, Ervil's not leaving the colony because he's the patriarch. He's kind of left behind, and he's the youngest. So Joel and Verlin are out. Ervil's mad because they keep coming back with new American wives, and he doesn't have one yet. And while he's there in the colony, one of his longtime family friends named Nephi comes to visit. He wanted to see for himself what the Colonial LeBaron looked like, and he was considering moving there because he wanted to have more wives, the whole reason any man would move there.
And he brought his sister with him.
No, he brought his wife with him.
Oh, shoot.
Her name's Anna Mae, and she had 5 children. Anna Mae was furious that her husband was even entertaining moving here. She showed up. She's like, this is a fucking shithole. And she started threatening to leave him if he tried to make her and the children move there. After Nephi visited, Ervil said, I want to come back with you to help you convince your wife to move here. Ervil's very convincing. From everything I've seen, he's good at reading the scriptures and just getting into people's heads that he knows what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. And he went and stayed with Nephi for a month. Whatever he said, he was successful in changing her mind. But while he was doing that, he had another ulterior motive. He was looking at Nephi's younger sister. Her name was Joy. I don't know how young she was. I think she was maybe 20 or something. So at least she wasn't a teenager.
Yeah.
But he convinced Nephi to let him marry his younger sister, and they got married while in America. Ervil knew that bringing Joy back with his 2 Mexican wives was not going to be a good thing because they already hated each other, and now he's going to show up with a little white girl from Utah.
Yeah.
Not going to be good.
Nope.
So Nephi moved his wife, Anna Mae, and his sister, who was now secretly married to Ervil, but Ervil's like, don't tell my other wives. So they all moved there, and Joy would live with Anna Mae for a while until he could break it to his first and second wives. I will tell you, when he broke it to his first wife, she like went batshit, and he ended up locking her up like they used to do to Lucinda, their sister.
Oh, I feel so bad for her.
And she doesn't speak the language.
Yeah. How
would
scary.
say that she was possessed. Like, that's just always what they went back to. If a woman's acting crazy, she's just possessed. Nephi goes back to the States after moving his wife and sister down there. And Ervil is coming over to Anna Mae and Joy's house all the time because he is secretly married to Joy after all. But all of a sudden, he starts taking a liking to Anna Mae. And he's flirting with her all the time. She's married.
Yeah. He did this with everyone else too.
Yeah, he was flirting with Irene, we knew, but Irene had no interest in him. She told him to like go away.
Stop it.
But Anna Mae was entertaining it. She liked him. She was flattered. He was a good looking guy.
Yeah.
And Joy saw this and she didn't like it. That was her sister-in-law and she thought weird things were going on. And Joy was like, fuck this, I'm out of here. She packed up her things and she left.
Oh, wow.
So now Ervil doesn't have his American wife anymore because she is done. He started really pursuing Anna Mae and he began plotting a way for her to become his wife.
He'd automatically take on 5 kiddos.
They don't care. They don't take care of their kids.
Oh,
These guys are
true.
not doing
Sorry.
anything with their children.
Sorry.
And this is when Ervil would claim to have his first vision. The Lord told him that if a woman felt like she had made a mistake and married the wrong man, she would not be held accountable for divorcing him. And if she should remarry, it would not be considered adultery.
Oh, wow. That's a good rule to have.
God told him this.
I know.
It's at a convenient time again. Anna Mae was pretty smitten with Ervil herself. I already mentioned that. He told her this and she's like, this is wonderful. I made a mistake in marrying Nephi. I don't want to be married to him anymore. Unbeknownst to Nephi, Anna Mae marries Ervil in colonial LeBaron.
I'm surprised that they got away with that, though, because so many of these women could just up and leave then.
If they have resources. And they do.
Yeah.
There are women who leave, but many of them stay trapped.
I made a mistake. You tried to con me into moving here. I don't want to be here.
Joy already left. She was only there a few months. But she left mostly because
he was flirting with
yeah.
her sister-in-law.
And also, I don't think she realized that he had 2 other wives and that they didn't agree with it. So she was also dealing with that drama. She was like, no, this isn't what I signed up for.
Yeah.
So Nephi returns a month later and Anna Mae is like, I'm not your wife anymore.
Oh, gosh.
Ervil came up to Nephi and said, yeah, I had this vision from God. Anna Mae is rightfully mine now, but it's okay. I have something for you, Nephi. I know 2 young girls from a Mexican family that will gladly marry you. I guess surprisingly, or maybe not so shocking because men are men, Nephi was like, okay.
Oh, cool.
Anna Mae became one of the most loyal wives to Ervil. She's wife number 3. Ervil then announces to the rest of the colony that he's the patriarch of the church and he had this vision from God and now he has divine authority over all marriages within the church. Joel, the prophet, I don't know if he's afraid of his brother or whatever, but he just kind of lets Ervil do whatever the fuck he wants. Joel's never pushing against him. Or maybe he's just happy to be gone in the States and not having to be down in Mexico. I don't know.
Yeah.
Joel is never mentioned much while Ervil's kind of taking over everything. He's just letting it happen. So you asked earlier why we would want more men in colonial LeBaron because the community is starting to grow. Joel and Ervil are attracting more converts and that's when they enact the tithing or communal property because that's part of the original Joseph Smith Brigham Young piece.
Right.
People are dumb enough or whatever to give up all of their goods when they move there and now they have enough people that they're actually starting to have some money for the first time in their lives because they grew up, you know, semi-okay, but they didn't have a lot of money. They weren't buying new cars or anything. We'll see Ervil really take to this money that is coming in. He'd always felt like he lived in squalor and didn't have anything that he wanted. They had grown up wearing a lot of hand-me-down clothes that didn't quite fit. And remember, he's like 6'4", I think. He's the tallest of the brothers. So he always had like pants that were too short. He felt like the poor cousin his whole life. And now he finally has some money coming in from this church. And he begins going out and buying very fashionable tailored clothing and shoes. He bought a brand new car that was a shiny gold. And he claimed that God had revealed that he needed a nicer vehicle because it would help bring in potential converts.
Sure.
Some of the colony residents kind of rolled their eyes at Ervil and they jokingly called his car the golden calf. But it actually did work for him. when he put on nice clothing, he cleaned up really good. And he had that charisma, and he had been studying all of these books that had been brought to him, divinely or whatever. And he was able to just whip out scriptures he had memorized, and he was using these and was really convincing those that he would preach to that the end days were nigh, Jesus was coming soon, and the only way that they would be saved is if they joined the one true church led by Joel LeBaron.
Which is called?
The Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. I can't remember that. I had to scroll up to remember it. It's so fucking long.
I'm trying to remember. Firstborn.
What's an acronym for
I know
that?
That's what I was trying to think of. I'm like, firstborn is full.
The Coffafot.
Just call it the firstborn.
Church of the Firstborn.
But he's not.
Joel is not the firstborn. I think Joel's like the thirdborn or something. I don't know. So during this time, there's a man named Dan Jordan who's going to be very important later. He rises up and he kind of becomes Ervil's right-hand man.
Okay.
He would obey Ervil with no questions asked and would accompany him on all their missions. The reason Dan Jordan, I guess, was so committed to Ervil is because Ervil would give Dan Jordan his 15-year-old daughter.
Oh.
Her name was Sarah Jane, and that became Dan Jordan's third wife. She was literally dragged to the altar kicking and screaming.
Oh, that kind of sucks.
It's not good. Ervil's still working hard because he wants to get to that 7-wife mark that is needed to receive godhood in the afterlife. He would go about this in a very devious and disturbing way, sometimes using his wife, Anna Mae. So I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of how Ervil built up his wives. He and Dan started making many trips to Arizona and Utah, and they found a new convert. His name was Louis Ray. And Louis had a grown daughter named Thelma that really wanted to join the Mexico colony, but her husband was not really interested. He didn't think it was going to be the right move for them. They had a really nice life in Utah.
Interesting that it's the wife.
Her father had convinced her, so maybe she was a daddy's girl. I don't really know. Ervil's there talking to Thelma and her husband, Bud, and while he's there, he sees their teenage daughter. Her name's Lorna. She's gorgeous. She's actually working as a model.
Wow.
And she noticed that her mother's like looking at Ervil like he's the fucking god, and it actually grossed her out. She's like, Mom, why are you so into this guy? And she's like, I don't like that guy. I can't wait till he leaves. She would bring her friends over and Ervil would just stare at them, and he was just such a creeper.
They're going to give her to him.
Ervil made his move while Bud was away at work. He told Thelma he had a vision and that their daughter Lorna would be instrumental in the building of the kingdom of God. She needed to be his wife, and he needed Thelma to convince Bud to let him have her. Thelma, because she's falling for him hook, line, and sinker, she feels like honored, like she was chosen by God and that her daughter is going to be this instrument of the kingdom of God. Somehow she convinced her husband too, and they let Ervil take Lorna with him back to Mexico as his wife. She was either 15 or 16 at the time. She hated it. She didn't want to be near him. I hear this through the book from Irene, but she tells Irene he has bad breath. She doesn't want to be around him, and she missed the comforts of a home. She had a really nice house in Utah.
Yeah.
And her parents were going to move down there, but they hadn't yet. So she was isolated down there, married to this man who's in his 30s, and she's 15 or 16. She would find herself pregnant within the first couple of months. She was beside herself when her parents did move down here, and she said even her older brothers converted to Joel's church, and she felt like she had just been sacrificed to Ervil.
Yeah, because she
was. Lorna was number 5. He had Delphina, Mary Lou, Joy. Even though Joy moved away, he was still counting her because they were celestial married. So that means even if she leaves, they didn't actually get divorced. She just left. And then Anna Mae, and now he has Lorna. So he needs 2 more wives.
I'm surprised he thinks she still counts, though. They didn't even live together.
He's not going to stop at 7. Spoiler alert.
Oh, okay.
So it doesn't really matter.
Okay.
Because what do you get when you get 14 wives? Double godhood. I don't know.
14 stars on your crown.
You ascend to a new layer of heaven. So on another mission trip to Salt Lake City, Dan and Ervil meet an older woman named Lorna Kirkendale, and she invites them to stay with her. I don't know why these women are inviting these men to stay with them, but whatever. While there, he meets her friend Linda Johnson, and she's in her 20s. She's an accountant, and she's just stopping by to see her friend Lorna. Ervil actually isn't attracted to her at all, but he sees her as someone who could help bring money into the colony. colony because she's supporting herself as a woman. And he sees her as kind of a tool that would help the colony. So he feels like she should become one of his wives. He uses her friend Lorna to convince Linda that she's going to burn in hell or whatever. I don't know how they scare these people, but they're like, if you're not in this church, you're not going to, I guess, ascend into heaven when Jesus comes back. And Linda went back to Mexico with him and became wife number 6.
To run the business.
To be in the accountant. Yeah, I think that's why. Like, she probably had the best of the wives because he wasn't really attracted to her. So he probably left her alone.
Yeah.
Quite often.
She just had to work.
Yes. I think it's later in the story, but at some point she moves back to America with one of his other wives and they live in a house in San Diego together and just work.
Interesting.
Because they need money. I guess that's what you do when you have like...
It was just a notch in his belt.
Yeah, he just is trying to get up to number 7 so he can be a god. Irene also mentions in her book, to make sure we understand the character of Ervil, that when he was in the colony, he would walk around in those fancy clothes and he would drive his golden calf car, but she said he never helped in any manual labor. He was useless. She said he was adamant that his direction from God was to only labor in spiritual matters.
Oh, okay.
So he never lifted a finger. She said he was the laziest person in the entire colony. He would lay in bed for most of the day, propped up by pillows, and have his wives just coming in and doting on him. He would direct them to keep the children away because having noisy children around would interrupt his spiritual thinking and writing.
Were there TVs back then for him to watch all day?
They had no electricity.
Oh, that's right.
And Anna Mae was his just little gopher wife. She was the main one that would kind of run access to Ervil. And you'd have to have an appointment to go talk to Ervil. And Irene said when you did talk to him, he would just be laying in bed, propped up against pillows like he's a fucking king or something. Anna Mae reveled in being that person that got to control access to him, I guess. It was mandated that no one was to speak to Ervil in a voice louder than a whisper because it bothered his thoughts.
Goodness. And she probably feels that way because an entire vision was created just so he could have her.
Right. She feels really special, I guess. She got to kind of be his favored wife because she would do whatever the fuck he wanted. Ervil being a colonial LeBaron was bad for all of the young teenage girls. And he was always scheming on ways to get these girls to be wives. She mentions one story of a family named Earl and Carol Jensen that had 4 children. And he always does this when the men are away. So Earl was gone to the States and Ervil began asking Carol to come see him, which felt special because he didn't let a lot of people come see him. And he told her that he needed one final wife to fulfill his godhood and that God had revealed with great urgency that their daughter Christina had been preordained before the world began to be one of his special wives. It was said that Carol almost lost her faith at that moment because she pushed back on Ervil and she said, that can't be. She's like, Christine's only 14 years old. But Ervil said, I know. It's difficult to understand the ways of God. I wouldn't have believed it myself and I don't want this for myself, but it's a direct revelation. Her age is actually significant. She has truly been chosen just because she's 14 years old. Just like the mother of Christ. Do you know that Mary was only 14 when she gave birth to Jesus Christ, our Savior? This kind of just shows you how manipulative this man could be, and people fell for it. Carol began crying. Ervil consoled her and told her that this is where her special calling came into play. Her job was to convince her daughter Christina to marry him. And Carol did not do this. She said, no, you're not fucking marrying my 14-year-old daughter. You're going to wait until my husband gets home. So she actually stood up to Ervil.
Good mama.
Unfortunately, Earl returned. I don't know what Ervil promised him, probably other girls or something. But Earl said, yeah, this is the calling of Jesus. And he actually married his own 14-year-old daughter to Ervil.
Well, then Earl's gotta die.
Ervil was 37 years old.
Oh, that's a big jump.
Disgusting.
It's a really big jump.
And this is when women in the community really started getting concerned.
Yeah, you took it too far.
You just married a 14-year-old and they all have daughters themselves.
Right.
But they also felt like they couldn't say anything. And shortly after Ervil married this 14-year-old girl, Joel, who's the prophet, married a 14-year-old girl.
Oh, no.
So it's starting.
And he's older, like
Yes.
way older.
He's 39. I think he's 2 years older.
Sorry. Just a little bit older. But
He's still,
older.
it's fucking a 14-year-old should
I
be
know.
dating at the most like a 16 or 17-year-old. The 14-year-old that Joel married was named Claudine, and her father felt special knowing that his daughter would forever be sealed to the prophet. Like, these people are just so fucking brainwashed. I can't imagine looking at a 37-year-old man and committing my 14-year-old daughter to him.
Mm-hmm.
These men who are committing their daughters to these men are also marrying 14-year-old daughters.
Yeah.
Of someone else.
They're all just going into cahoots with each other.
Unfortunately, Ervil did not stop after his 7-wife quota. He was going after all the teenage daughters now. There was another family that came down to visit. They were thinking about converting, and they brought their 15-year-old daughter with them. And he saw her, and he had to have her. And he told this couple that he had a vision that if they took their daughter back to California, that she would become a first-class whore. That's what he said. And he said her only chance of redemption... People believe this shit. Her only chance of redemption was for her to stay in Mexico and live there. He didn't say he wanted to marry her. He just said she needs to stay here so she doesn't become this like whore or whatever. And so they were convinced, and they left her there with another friend and their family, thinking she would be safe. But as soon as the parents were gone, he started moving in. Her name was Debbie, and he became a complete world-class creep towards her. And she actually would go and complain to Irene that he gave her the creeps.
Oh, these poor girls.
And Debbie would do everything she could to stay away from Ervil. But this is when he enlisted Anna Mae, and she started enticing Debbie to come hang out at her house. And she would offer things like fudge, which nobody ever had fudge, and that was hard for anyone to turn down. And she'd be like, come play Monopoly with me. And she tried to make Debbie feel comfortable. But then she began pressuring her and saying, you know, you should really marry Ervil to fulfill the kingdom of God. And Debbie was like, no. And she stopped accepting any invitation from Anna Mae. And then one day she was outside doing laundry, and Anna Mae came rushing out telling her that she needed help. It was urgent. And Debbie followed Anna Mae into the house. As soon as she walked in the house, Ervil was there with his right-hand man, Dan Jordan. They locked her into the house and let her know she was going to be married to Ervil.
Oh my goodness.
Anna Mae took her hand and recited the vows on her behalf. And Debbie, only 15, she had no adults really to turn to. Her family was gone. She said she felt like she had to comply. So she was married to Ervil. And she said right after the ceremony was over, Ervil forced her to kiss him, and she said his breath was absolutely horrible and she just wanted to die.
Oh my God.
He wouldn't stop there. He set his sights on another pretty young woman from the colony. Her name was Rosemary. She was already married to a man, but her husband was away in the States working. Ervil made his move. He convinced her that he was meant to be her true husband and that she could help fulfill the kingdom of God. And she somehow fell for it. Again, her husband comes back, and just like Anna Mae, she's like, oh, by the way, I am now sealed to Ervil for all of eternity. Sorry.
So this is 9.
He's now number 9, and this devastated Ralph. It caused him to lose all faith in the prophet.
Of course.
His wife just got stolen from him.
Yeah.
And Irene talks about how horrible it was to watch because Ervil was teaching like adultery was wrong and blah, blah, blah. But she said he just made his own rules.
Yeah.
And he would always say, God gave me this vision. And Joel wasn't doing anything. She's like, Joel was our prophet. And Irene believed in Joel at this time. She doesn't now. And she was like, nothing was being done. Ervil was just doing whatever the fuck he wanted, and nobody could really speak up against him. So it was like this helpless place for all the women. And she mentioned that the colony became like this haven for pedophiles and men that weren't really what you would consider kingdom of God quality.
Yeah, sounds like it.
And some of the members started questioning how Joel and Ervil were deciding who they would let join the church. It seemed like they cared more about who had money versus the moral character of the men.
Who had money and teenage daughters.
It's true. This is like the perfect place for a man who wants to be a pedophile.
It really is. Because you have all these kiddos running around too, because everybody's having babies.
She did mention there was one man in his 60s who had never been married, and he joined the colony and moved to Mexico. And he was actually caught inviting young girls around the age of 7 to 8 to his house. And then he would expose himself. And she said this was one time the men stepped up and said, no, this isn't going to happen. They thought he was a problem, and they did drive him out.
Okay. Okay, good.
But they're marrying girls that are 14 years old.
I know.
So it seems hypocritical, but it's like they had this unsaid age.
Okay.
14 was marryable because that was the Virgin Mary's age. As far as the state of women in the colony, it was pretty abysmal. I did want to read a passage from Irene Spencer's book. She said, "Women were not valued in the colony. If we had opinions, we learned to keep them to ourselves. We knew our duty was to bear children for our future inheritance in another world. We were told repeatedly not to let a year go by without seeing that a child was born under this holy covenant of plural marriage. We had been intimidated and frightened by the men. Birth control was a wicked practice that would take us straight to hell. The average number of children among polygamists is 12, although many have 14 to 18 children. No woman dared mention her dissatisfaction with bearing children. She obediently accepted her role without complaint. Her godhood was at stake. Childbearing was used as a means of control. No mother with that many children would dare to leave the group because the women understood the rules. The children that they birthed automatically belonged to the husband. So they were telling the women they could freely leave whenever they wanted to, but they would have to forfeit your children. So that's how they controlled women.
Oh my goodness. And so I'm understanding this correctly. Every woman was expected to be pregnant every year?
No, it's among all the women there should be at least one woman born.
All the wives to one man.
Yes.
Okay.
There should be one child born every year to every man.
Okay.
She said she remembers a conversation that her husband Verlin had with Joel, who was the prophet, and she was in their presence at the time. And Verlin was talking about his sixth wife, Susan, and saying that she kept leaving with her 3 small children because she was saying Mexico was not the place. And she said, Joel, the prophet, this was the advice he gave to his brother. You got to keep her pregnant. Soon she will have so many kids that she won't be able to leave.
Oh my God.
So they knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
And Irene herself, she says in her book, there was no leaving for her because as she's listening to her husband and brother talk about women in front of her, she was pregnant with her 13th child.
My gosh.
She also said it was commonplace in the colony for men to spank their wives to keep them in line or lock them up if they were having a crazy spell. I already mentioned that earlier with Ervil's wife, Delphina. So she said defiance was rare from the wives. She believes the main reason they married the girls as young as they did is because they were less likely to push back. If you get them at 14, that's all they know.
Yeah, I get that.
And by the time they become mature women who would push back, they love their children and they can't leave their children.
Yep.
It's a trap.
Yep.
These women are trapped.
Can you imagine having that many children?
No.
I have 1.
You have no birth control.
Yeah, well, I know.
You can't tell your man no. Like,
right.
Irene was kind of like a midwife in the colony, and she has a lot of stories in her book about horrible experiences for these women because they have no electricity, they have no running water, their hygiene is probably not great.
Yeah.
And they're having so many children, and they're not getting proper doctor care, and I don't know what it would be like to live here.
I still can't actually imagine what they are living in right now because now we're like in the 60s.
They're all living in these like crappy
mud
maybe
houses.
1 or 2 bedroom houses.
Okay.
She talks about one of the families that moves in, I think it might have been Thelma and Bud because they moved from Utah and had money. They were the first ones in the colony to have a flushing toilet.
Oh.
It is not a place you want to live.
Yeah.
Remember, they all feel spiritually superior. They feel like they know something that other people don't and that they are following the one true prophet. And they are always told that if you are the chosen people, you're persecuted, like Israel. And like all of this stuff is just beaten into their head over and over and over.
Choose not to be the persecuted one.
I can never understand it. I think about, I don't want to get political here, but people who are following Trump are falling for things that we all know are like full on lies. Like it can be traced back to he said this 2 years ago and now he's saying this and they still follow him.
Or saying something happened during Biden's presidency, but it actually did happen during Trump's, not Biden's. Right. We don't like Biden, by the way.
No.
At all. Free Palestine.
Yes.
But here's the problem, is Trump's even more gung-ho for all that bullshit.
But he won't say it out loud.
He won't say it out loud. He's more in cahoots than the Biden administration. We're just fucked over here. And nothing we want, none of what the Americans actually want is going to happen for us. And it's going to be a very scary next, I don't know how long.
I've always looked at cults. They've always fascinated me. Like, how can people fall for it? And we're fucking watching people fall for it.
Exactly.
And people that we love
that we
and
love,
are close to us, that I know they do not agree with the things that this man agrees with, and they are marching right behind him.
Yep.
And they would never even think of voting for anyone else. And I am flabbergasted. And the only thing is this cult mentality. People fall for stuff.
Yep.
Anyways, Ervil needed another wife, and he does find another wife. Her name is Vonda White. She is of age, at least. She was actually married to another man that came from California, and she became smitten with Ervil. Something about him. These women liked him, or they liked the idea of being with someone who's high up in the, new cult or whatever. But she felt honored to become his 10th wife, and she would become another super loyal wife, similar to Anna Mae. And they said that she would just hang on every word he spoke.
Not to be confused with Vanna White.
No.
Although I picture that as you're saying that, I was like, oh yeah, I see how they fit.
It's funny you say that because she was from California and she's described as being like a beautiful California girl. So she could look like Vanna White.
Yeah, that's what I pictured.
But without the big fancy ball gowns because they have no money. So while Ervil was building up his own quiver of wives, he was also using his daughters as pawns in the game of gaining more money for the colony. He would attract wealthier converts by offering up his teenage daughters as wives if they would contribute to the cause. He married off several of his girls from ages 14 to 16 to men well into their 40s. The colony continued to grow at a fast rate. Many people were moving to Mexico to live their dream of polygamy. The problem was that now the colony had grown to such a large amount that they had more people than they actually had money coming in. So they were running into financial issues.
Okay.
Also, from these communal coffers, Ervil was taking a very high percentage for himself.
Of course
and his family's needs, although he wasn't really giving much to his family. It was really to him. Joel, the prophet, and Alma, his oldest brother, they were the main overseers of the finances, but they didn't really know how to manage money. And they were writing checks that were bouncing, and creditors started knocking at their doors. Ervil had this revelation that came from God, and his idea was that they would make up all the money that they owed to their creditors by asking followers to donate whatever they had, many from their life savings, and he convinced 5 of their followers to travel to Las Vegas to gamble with the cash that they were able to collect.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah. He told them that he had had this vision that they would go there and bring all the riches of the Gentiles back to the church.
Interesting.
Joel was along for the ride. He thought this was a great idea.
He's like, I will love that vacation.
He didn't go, but he bestowed his blessing as the prophet on the group. Ervil did go with them. Right before they went downstairs, they were at the Horseshoe, old school Vegas, and they were going to go and play blackjack. They prayed in their room and then went downstairs. They believed they had been giving the blessing of God himself, and they laid down very large bets.
This is interesting.
Their hopes were quickly dashed, and they lost thousands upon thousands of dollars quickly.
Yeah, that's
to
how
the
blackjack
casino.
Works.
Dumbasses. I don't know what else to say. They were crushed. They blamed Satan for cunningly stealing their money.
You went to Vegas.
Yeah. And it was Ervil's idea. On the way home, they're driving back from Vegas to Mexico, and the whole way home, Ervil told them that the reason the money was taken is because someone in the group was not righteous enough.
Oh boy.
And they were lusting after money for the wrong reasons.
It wasn't Ervil.
It wasn't him. Remember, he's like above it all.
It was his idea, but it wasn't him.
It's sad because one of the men in the group had donated his entire life savings to this Vegas trip. I don't know if I feel sad for him because he moved down there to marry teenage girls. So I don't know.
Very true. Very true.
When they got back and they told Joel what happened, Joel, as the prophet, said, God wants to give us his treasures. This is just a small setback. The scripture promises the riches of the Gentiles, and we will prosper mightily as we continue to build up the kingdom of God. This was just a test to see where our hearts really are.
So go find more people with more money and go back to Vegas.
And Ervil's like, I don't have enough daughters to attract more rich men right now. What are we going to do? So Irene recalls a random day at the colony when Ervil gathered up the women just on a whim because he had to relay God's most recent order, another vision. He told all of the women that everyone here is responsible to somebody and for somebody. We are all connected. You are your brother's keeper. If you see someone bad-mouthing your leaders and you do not turn that person in, then you will receive the punishment that they deserve. Even if it's your husband, your mother, your sister, or your child, if any of you think about having an affair, lying, stealing, gossiping, or not keeping my trust, you will be found out. We all need to be on the lookout to keep sin from raising its wicked head among us. This put all the women in a weird position. And she talks about how he was essentially asking them to tattle on each other and on their husbands because he was starting to doubt that some of the men, after this Vegas thing and people losing their money, he began to worry that men would start leaving. So he wanted to keep a pulse on it. And what better way than to threaten the women? And Ervil was always there, remember? So the women were afraid of him and would, for whatever reason, follow him. The women did eventually, like some of them were telling their husband about this meeting and saying, like, I don't feel good about this. And some of the men confronted Ervil and he owned up to it. And he was like, yeah. He's like, why are you coming at me? It's because you're probably doing something wicked. And he told everyone over the age of 15 that he had another revelation from God and they needed to come and attend this sermon of his. And he opened his Book of Mormon and he read one verse to everyone in the colony.
This is the killing.
Said, and it came to pass that the Spirit said unto me again, slay him, for the Lord hath delivered him into thy hands. Behold, the Lord slayeth the wicked to bring forth his righteous purpose. It is better that one man should perish than that a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief. Then he said, see, it's right here, as plain as the nose on your face. I see by some of your faces that some of you are upset, but in case you don't know, Christ said he did not come to bring peace. He came to bring the sword. This was his first big gesture at moving the church toward a policy of blood atonement. It would take on some horrible turns in the near future. He also referred to a verse that was brought up somehow through Joseph Smith. I don't remember this from the Bible, but it says, there is not a man or woman who violates the covenants made with their God that will not be required to pay the debt. The blood of Christ will never wipe that out. Your own blood must atone for it. I feel like this was brought by Brigham Young when he started doing his sermons. And remember, Ervil has been reading all of that and letting his brain rot.
Right.
He's becoming obsessed with this idea of blood atonement. He was quoting many of the other famous prophets over the years and basically saying it's okay to kill a sinner because in doing so, you're actually saving their soul. And if you keep them alive, they would continue to sin and condemn themselves to hell. So at this point, we're in the late 1960s. Joel had been the prophet leading the church for over a decade at this point, and Ervil has been the patriarch, but it seemed like Ervil just started wanting more.
Yeah.
He felt like he knew the scriptures better than Joel and that he would be a better steward to the followers of the church. And he started to get more vocal about this, especially when he was the only one at the colony.
I mean, it's kind of true.
Joel, Verlin, and Alma are really the ones out there doing a lot of the work to bring the money back into the colony and converting the people.
They're doing the missionary work.
And finding the young girls for wives.
And Ervil's just behind marrying young girls.
He's creeping on all the girls in the area and he's going to start marrying women again. We're at number 10 right now. He still has more to go. One of these times while he was the only one left behind at the colony, he called yet another meeting of the wives. He made them all swear under oath not to repeat one word of what he was going to share, not even to their husbands. Irene recalls this in her book, and she said that in this sermon, Ervil said, there are women here under the sound of my voice whose husbands are spineless. Some even allow you women to run their lives.
Oh, goodness.
Some of these worthless men will never be able to exalt you in the celestial kingdom. Your only hope is to find a godly man whose life has been completely dedicated to the Lord, i.e. himself.
Wow, he wants all of the wives now?
I don't know, but he says, pretty soon, a few of you women will find your husbands pushing up carrots in the garden. So,
6 feet under.
So he's telling the women essentially what he's planning to do.
Yeah.
Irene said she was horrified knowing that he was crazy enough to do this. She felt like he was stating his intention to move forward with blood atonement against certain men within the colony that he deemed to be unworthy. And then he also began speaking of false prophets in the other sects of fundamentalist Mormons and how they too should be struck down with God's own hand for their wicked participation in stealing money that should all be coming to Joel Joel because Joel is the true prophet.
Oh, okay.
And then he reminded them all how they're so blessed to be part of the true kingdom of God in the church of the firstborn of the fullness of times. Got it now. He said all other churches would be cursed and damned to hell. She said this was the time when she realized that he had snapped.
Yeah.
He kept them kind of held captive and just kept preaching for like hours. He really instilled this like fear in them.
And if he had schizophrenia or something like that too, it's completely unchecked.
Yeah. And we don't know if he did. We know his brother and his sister both had something.
Yeah.
I think probably all of them could have had some touch.
I'm assuming he had something as well because he then takes it further than everyone else.
He has narcissism for sure. He told the women as he's like rambling on, he mentions Rulon Allred, who runs the most popular, if you want to call it that, sect because he had the most followers. And she said the way he went on and on about Rulon Allred, she could just tell he was like so jealous of him. And Rulon Allred was her uncle. So she started worrying
that he was going to go kill him.
Before ending the meeting with the women, he told them once again that they better keep this all secret or he would find them and there would be consequences. But Irene said she didn't give a fuck. She didn't say it that way because she doesn't cuss, but Irene said as soon as it was over and Joel came back to the colony, she got time with him and she told him, and she also told her husband Verlin that Ervil had snapped. And she said that both of them just kind of laughed and they're like, oh, that's Ervil being Ervil and being passionate, and they weren't worried about it.
That's scary.
But they would come to regret that because a couple months later, Ervil will begin his campaign of terror and intimidation against those that were not within the church. He would send Dan Jordan, his right-hand man and what I call his personal bulldog, to see Rulon Allred and gave him an ultimatum. He told Rulon that he needed to accept and follow the revelation given to him by Joel and that he should move his several thousand followers from Utah to Mexico and that all money from his followers should be sent directly to Ervil LeBaron. If he didn't comply, he would face consequences.
Wow. Okay.
Dan Jordan went through several different sects other than Rulon's and delivered the same message, basically saying, come follow Joel. This is your last chance.
This is wild.
This is when Joel and Verlin really started to think, oh, maybe our brother has gone off the deep end. Maybe he's taking on his role a little too seriously. Like, this is not the way to get followers. They also had people coming to them saying, why are you letting your brother go out and speak on your behalf? He's saying some really scary things. People began doubting that Joel was actually the prophet because he wasn't doing anything to stop his brother.
Oh, yeah.
So Joel felt the pressure and he decided that he in fact did need to do something about Ervil. He set up a private meeting with himself, his brother Verlin, and Ervil. And they told Ervil that he was going to be released as patriarch of the church.
He anointed himself, so...
Well, Joel actually gave him the role of patriarch in the very, very beginning. They said that Ervil wept openly, but he told his brothers that it was actually a relief to be released. He said the burden of being the patriarch had just become too much for him, and he was sorry. He had snapped. It was just this pressure.
I don't believe you.
Joel would announce to the entire church on November 22nd of 1969 that Ervil was stepping down and that Verlin would now step into the role of patriarch. Ervil seemed really humble in front of everyone, and his brothers said kind things about him. He said kind things back to them. They thanked him for his service. They all hugged. Things seemed like they would be okay, but none of them could know how much this deeply wounded Ervil. He felt betrayed, and hiding behind his facade of humility and acceptance was a deep rage.
Yeah.
He was already plotting how he would retaliate against his own brothers.
Oh boy.
This is where we see Ervil come forward, and he's going to make his own claim to be the one mighty and strong. He now said he actually had received the mantle from his father Dayer 8 years before Joel did on Dayer's deathbed.
Oh, okay.
And he began to assert himself as the true prophet. Surprisingly, some men followed him. Of course, Dan Jordan, his right-hand man that was married to, I think, 3 of his daughters at this point.
Yeah, he better follow him. That's some connection right there.
Yeah. And they began to go on this whole campaign vilifying both of the brothers, Joel and Verlin, stating that they, in fact, were false prophets. They also were making comments that any man who opposed Ervil being the one mighty and strong would be blood atoned.
Whoa.
Yeah.
We're going to murder you. if you do not follow me.
This was happening in Mexico, but it hadn't really moved back to the States yet. So a lot of the people in the States didn't know that Ervil had been doing this uprising against his brothers. And so he and Dan Jordan would travel to America, and they would start telling other people that they were still working on behalf of Joel, and they would ask for money to support Joel's church. They would take the money and then say that Joel will pay you back. So they were essentially conning these people and building up money for their own church. And then those people would come to Joel and be like, hey, your brother said you're going to pay me back. And Joel's like, my brother's not part of the church. So they did this for a couple of years, actually.
Wow.
Joel, I don't know if he's just like the most patient, understanding man ever. He never really went after his brother. It took him 2 years to become savvy to what his brother was doing. So he's probably not the smartest guy in the world. But he then, in August of 1971, officially excommunicated both Ervil and Dan Jordan from the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. I don't think they cared at that point, but...
They were already starting their own thing.
They said he didn't even attend the meeting when they excommunicated him. But this felt like the ultimate betrayal. They kicked him out of the church. Within a few days, he retaliated by going to Salt Lake City and incorporating a church of his own called the Lambs of God. I didn't know you could incorporate a church in Salt Lake City, but both of these guys did. So I guess you can incorporate versions of the Mormon church. I don't really know how that works.
I'm wondering why Salt Lake City would allow them to incorporate a church knowing that they're a polygamous group.
Don't understand that part, but Rulon Allred was also able to do that. When we get to the end of this, I think I have a list of all the different sects of fundamentalists that exist today.
Oh, that's good.
And they are somehow incorporated, connected to the Mormon church. I don't understand it. So some of you out there who understand it better maybe can tell us, but
it's
I didn't have time to look into it.
Too, that they're back and forth between America and Mexico.
But it started with the original prophets, you know, with Brigham Young and Joseph Smith. They sent people to Mexico.
Like legally, how are they back and forth, and where's their citizenship? Are their children Mexican or are they American?
The children are mostly Mexican, and this is covered in the documentary because the kids talk about it and being sneaked in over the border. And they would have like 3 or 4 kids that were American citizens, and they would pass the paperwork to the car behind them. They would do all kinds of like interesting things to get kids back and forth across the border. But they also left most of the kids in Mexico. So he incorporated the Lambs of God, and Ervil took 3 families with him to this new church. The Jordans, of course. Dan was always there. He also took the Chenoweths and the Rioses. 2 of the Chenoweth brothers, Mark and Dwayne, would become Ervil's commandos, and their 3rd brother, Victor, had money, and he was the one that would finance the Lambs of God. Thelma, remember her? She was the one who gave her young daughter Lorna over to Ervil for marriage. She still worshipped the ground Ervil walked on, and she was designated as the matriarch of the group. This is a big deal because women weren't usually exalted, but Ervil's starting his own thing, and he knows Thelma's going to be helpful.
Yeah.
The 2 Rios brothers, Raul and Gamiel, they're going to become Ervil's bodyguards.
Yeah, this is sounding a bit mafia-ish now.
Very, yeah. Doesn't sound happy-go-lucky, churchy at all.
No.
Ervil would also convince the father of 2 teenage girls within the Rios family to let him marry their young daughters. So he would add his 11th and 12th wives, Yolanda and Teresa Rios. And then he had 2 stepchildren from his marriage to Anna Mae, because remember, she was married to another man and had children coming in. And these stepchildren were Ramona and Eddie Marston, and they kind of became his soldiers for hire.
Interesting.
They would kill whenever he gave them the order.
She had like 4. Or no, she had like 8. How many children did she have to start off with?
I think she came there with 4, if I remember right.
4 children, right.
So, it's really hard to keep track.
There's too many.
So many. And a lot of them have the same names because they, you know, name each other after prophets of Mormonism. So these families began working together to write up pamphlets to distribute to start building the Lambs of God Church. One of these pamphlets was titled Priesthood Revealed, claiming that Ervil was God's top representative on earth and that people were failing to recognize him as such. There was a colony nearby that Joel had started when I mentioned that there were getting to be too many people in colonial LeBaron. At one point, Joel went and bought some land not too far away, and they named that colony Los Molinos.
Okay.
And this is where they would focus their intimidation tactics on. This is where most of the church services would take place at this point. point, they built a new temple there. Irene talks about them all being in their regular church service, and Ervil just came waltzing in with the Chenoweths and the Rioses, and they just kind of took over. The teenagers of the Chenoweth party just pushed somebody over, sat down, and started playing piano in the middle of one of the guys doing a sermon. And everyone was just kind of shocked, and they didn't know what to think about it.
It's all kind of Wild Westy.
Really, it is.
Interesting.
And she said the followers all fled from the church, and as they're coming out, Dan Jordan was standing outside with his gun clearly on display.
I was going to say with an AK-47.
Not quite yet, but Ervil then showed up and reprimanded everyone outside of the church and said, "Why are you worshiping inside of my church?"
Whoa.
And it was reported back to Joel because, of course, he did this when his brother was off in the States. Joel, I don't understand this guy, trying to give his brother the benefit of the doubt, was like, you know what? There's room for both of us here. If you want to worship as lambs of God, you can do that on days that we're not using the church. So
it sounds like Joel kind of followed polygamy to the core in a way that it was taught by a prophet, and he's really following it because that's really what he believes. And so he's treating others and his brother kindly and forgiving them. And that's what it seems like.
And everything I read, it sounds like Joel was a pretty good guy.
Yeah.
He didn't seem crazy other than him claiming to be the one mighty and strong, which is a little crazy.
And having some younger wives.
Yeah.
You can't really let it go, but at the same time, it's like he keeps not fighting.
And Verlin was the same way because Irene was always going to her husband and saying, "I don't think Ervil's right. Something's wrong with Ervil." And he's like, that's just Ervil. That's just our brother. And
and it's their younger brother, too. So they're
maybe
letting
that's
him get away with stuff.
And we don't know what that relationship dynamic was like.
That's true.
Joel was willing to compromise, and I don't think he ever really realized how twisted his brother was.
And they're not really spending time together all these years. They're completely separated.
They are. Irene mentions that Ervil is still living down there in Colonia LeBaron and visiting Los Molinos. Verlin and Joel and Alma were gone all the time, and Ervil was there, and the women were just like stuck with this crazy man.
Mm-hmm.
And she said that while the men were away, he would make claims that he owned all of the property because he was the one true prophet. And he would instill this fear in the women that if they didn't convert over and convince their husbands to convert over to the Lambs of God, that he would evict them from their homes. So this is all leading up to August 20th of 1972. Joel LeBaron was back in Mexico after traveling for a while in the States. And he was visiting his two colonies. He had just been to Los Molinos, and he was driving to Colonia LeBaron with two of his wives and several of their children. They stopped at the home of Benjamin Zarate because Joel had left his Buick car there with the intention of towing it back to Colonia LeBaron, and Gamaliel Rios was there. Now remember, Gamaliel Rios is part of Ervil's gang, whatever you want to call it.
His bodyguard, watchdog.
Yeah. He was there along with Benjamin Zarate's son, Andres. They told Joel that someone else had actually taken the keys to his Buick, and they needed to go over to that house to get the keys. Andres offered to drive Joel's truck with his family in it over to the house while Gamaliel began feigning interest in speaking with Joel about some spiritual matters. Now, Joel, knowing that Gamaliel was on the side of Ervil, thought that he was having like this crisis and they just wanted to talk. So they are luring him, taking him into this house.
Yeah.
So it's a setup.
Mm-hmm.
Andres was trying to get the family out of the way so they would not witness what they had planned for Joel. What the two men did not know is that Joel's 14-year-old stepson, he had actually sneaked into the back of the Buick and was hanging out in the car instead of going with the rest of the family.
Oh.
So he would witness some of what was about to happen. So after the family drove off with Andres, Gamaliel lured Joel inside the house to discuss church matters. And nearby, Ervil with his cousin Conway and Dan Jordan were waiting in a car. They were expecting Gamaliel to kill Joel inside the house and then come and jump in the car and they would take off. But they became nervous when it seemed like Joel had been inside the house for a while. He should have been dead by now. So Dan Jordan's like, I'll go in and take care of this myself. He went inside. He found Joel and Gamaliel just talking. He struck Joel on the head with a steel wrench. And when he fell to the floor, they then hit him with a heavy wooden chair. It was said that Joel fought the two men. Dan pulled out his gun and put the pistol into Joel's mouth and pulled the trigger. Then Dan Jordan shot him a second time in the forehead.
Yikes, this Dan guy.
Yeah.
He seems ruthless. Maybe the other guy was actually converting.
I think Gamaliel, maybe he was young.
Yeah,
they were teenagers. I don't think he could follow through with it.
For all we know, he like tried to start something and Joel was talking him down. Like, why are you doing this?
Right.
What are you doing this
and
for?
Then Dan's in there like, nope, time. And he just goes and he smacks him on the head with a wrench and shoots him in the mouth. And that young stepson that's outside in the car, he sees Dan come running out the front door, looks both ways to see if anyone was around. And then he said Gamaliel actually came out one of the side windows. And then he said they both walked off to a car and then they sped off.
They left Joel in the house?
Yes. So Joel's in the house. The little boy had heard the gunshots.
Okay.
So he knew something was going on, but he had also known to stay hidden.
Right.
But he was kind of just peeking out. And when he saw that they were gone for good and had driven off, he got out and he walked into the house. And he would find his stepfather dead on the floor. He ran to a small church nearby and the police were called pretty quickly. During the investigation, many members of the colony suspected it was done by Ervil.
Well, yeah, he's stomping around saying, hey, we're going to kill you if you don't follow us.
Yeah, exactly.
So, of course, it's him.
And then the police showed up to Anna Mae's house looking for Ervil. They could tell he had just been there, but she had helped him escape. Joel's followers were in complete shock and dismay. Their prophet was dead. That wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be alive to usher the second coming of Jesus.
Right.
At the funeral, there was a large turnout, not only of Joel's followers, but actually from the local Mexican communities. He was well respected in the Mexican cities where he did business. At the funeral, Irene recounts Ervil's third crazy wife. Anna Mae walked straight up to the casket in front of all the mourners and said he deserved it.
Whoa, Anna Mae.
She's just as sick at this point as Ervil.
Right. It's an obsession.
Yeah. With Joel dead, somebody had to step up to lead the church of the firstborn of the fullness of times. And Verlin was the likely leader.
I'm assuming that the rest of their siblings are just members throughout the church.
They were all under Joel.
Okay.
There's no other siblings that follow Ervil.
Okay.
And immediately after Joel's funeral, Verlin, and there was actually another LeBaron brother I haven't mentioned yet. His name's Florin. These interesting names. They went to both Mexican and U.S. authorities warning them that Ervil was a loose cannon at this point. They said, he's been making threats. We haven't been taking them seriously. And now we're worried that there was going to be more bloodshed. This was just the beginning. Ervil, having successfully blood atoned his own brother Joel, that's what he thought he was doing, he believed that the followers of Joel would now come to him because it's obvious he's the true prophet.
Right.
He's delusional. So of course that didn't happen. Instead, they were all fearful of him. He went on this whole campaign of writing more pamphlets and threatening to destroy anyone who opposed his claim of being the one mighty and strong, because that's the way that you attract followers. Follow me or die.
I know. Wow, that's crazy.
Verlin and Florin, the two brothers that were worried at this point, they printed a poster with their brother's picture on it, and they offered a $10,000 reward to anyone that could offer information that would lead to his arrest. Ervil feels like he didn't actually pull the trigger. His hands are clean in the matter in his mind because he is overly confident and narcissistic. He shows up to the Mexican authorities on December 13th of 1972, and he turns himself in.
Okay.
He demands that all charges be dropped. The way that the law works in Mexico is that when they apprehend a suspect, there's a 72-hour window for those who want to try and get that suspect convicted to come up with evidence against them. All the members of Colonial LeBaron and Los Molinos gathered what they had about Ervil making these threats. They have all this writing because the guy's stupid. He's like writing down that he's going to kill all these people. So the authorities decided that there was enough evidence within those 72 hours to keep him behind bars until the trial would occur. He was actually kept in jail for almost a year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then the trial came up and multiple people showed up to speak against him to prove that, yes, he didn't physically kill his brother, but he was the mastermind behind it.
He's the only reason why
his brother
happened.
Exactly. Ervil actually took the stand in his trial and he lied through his teeth and said, I would never hurt my own brother. How could you say that about me? I am the one mighty and strong. I'm the prophet. Why would I kill my brother? He also said he had proof that he was nowhere near the house on the day of the crime. And he also had his loyal wives testifying on his behalf. He was with them. He's never said anything bad about Joel. but doesn't matter. On November 9th of 1973, Ervil was found guilty for the murder of his brother Joel LeBaron and sentenced to 12 years in prison. At the time of his conviction, the police were still looking for Dan Jordan, Gamaliel and Raul Rios, Andres Zarate, and his cousin Conway LeBaron. They had enough information to know that they were involved in the murder, but they were hidden really well and they could not find them. So the members were breathing easy and feeling safer, knowing that Ervil would now be locked up for at least 12 years and he couldn't continue his reign of terror on anyone else.
He can have phone calls. He can write letters.
Yeah.
He can do a lot from jail. In fact, it's easier to do it from jail because he has nothing else to do.
That's what Irene says in her book. She said, I never felt safe. That even though he was behind bars, he had his minions out there that could do anything. And she knows that he had a long list of people he wanted to blood atone. She knew that Verlin would probably be his next target now that Joel was dead. So right away, Ervil's followers, he did have a decent amount. They began raising money and they were able to bribe the authorities because it is Mexico after all. Ervil was back on the streets within 1 month of being convicted for 12 years.
Whoa.
It was
Is
miraculous.
that a record?
I don't know.
I mean,
it's
is
Mexico.
that a record? I don't know.
I'm not sure, but his ruling was overturned by a higher court in Mexicali. So Ervil's back on the streets and he's telling everybody it's God's will because he's the real prophet.
And
of course he won't stay in
this is
jail.
how he gets involved with the cartel. I never really pictured Mormonism and
The cartels.
the cartels together. It's an interesting story.
After Joel's death, the three remaining brothers, Verlin, Florin, and Alma, decided that they had it wrong. In fact, the second coming of Christ was not going to happen in Mexico. This was not the new Zion. Instead, it was in Nicaragua.
Oh.
And
Keep going south.
yeah, they also thought it would be best to separate themselves from Ervil now that he was out and about again. So the brothers purchased some land in the Bouquet River area, which was the jungles of Nicaragua, and they began making plans on building a colony there and transferring their wives and children.
That would not be as easy to travel back and forth to America from.
I wouldn't think so. And I think Nicaragua has a lot of, not that Mexico doesn't at this time, but Nicaragua, I think, was even more corrupt with the government and things like that. But they wouldn't care if polygamists moved there.
Right. They're like, here you go, white man, have that beach.
And they're like, whatever. The problem is that they couldn't get all of their families moved quickly enough. Ervil had plans. This time he enacted a strike on the Los Molinos colony. Ervil told his followers that he had another revelation from God and was specifically told that he needed to kill his brother Verlin. He gave orders to a group to travel to Los Molinos and that Verlin would be there when they arrived and fall easily into their hands per God's wishes. His instructions were to throw fire bombs into all of the houses of Verlin's wives, and then once the people came out of the houses, to open fire with shotguns.
Holy shit. That's too much.
They said he laughed thinking about it and told his followers that God had wondrous plans of retribution. He also told his followers that he didn't care if they destroyed Los Molinos because all of the buildings there belonged to him anyways, so you can burn them down.
That must have been how many children?
So the group Ervil chose to carry out this plan included some of his own children, stepchildren, and sons-in-laws. They all believed they were carrying out the prophet's sacred order of blood atonement. The killers showed up in 2 trucks late at night the day after Christmas, December 26th of 1974. It was pure chaos throughout the whole colony. Houses were going up in flames as firebombs were thrown into them, and children and women were mostly what was there. They began just shooting randomly at whoever. While shooting up the place, it was said that those carrying out Ervil's orders were laughing, cheering, and mocking those while they were crawling to safety, trying to avoid the guns. These are children and women.
This is not religion.
No. This raid was covered by local news in Mexico and got back to the U.S. And government officials would storm the area within a day to help. Shockingly, despite all of this destruction, only 2 people died.
Wow. That is a surprise.
So 2 people died and 13 were wounded. Verlin was not even there. So Verlin was not delivered as Ervil had prophesied, saying that God was going to. It didn't happen. Instead, Verlin had been down in Nicaragua when this attack happened, but he did return to Mexico for the funerals of the 2 boys who died. and to help rebuild Los Molinos, because most of the people living there were his family, because I believe Verlin had something like 9 wives.
So it's all his wives and all his children.
Verlin knew his brother had really lost it at this point. So he moved all of his wives and children into hiding. They would go live with friends in other parts of Mexico or the U.S., and he did prematurely move some of them to Nicaragua, even though it wasn't quite ready. Irene was one of them that got moved to Nicaragua, and she talks about how absolutely horrible it was. Their dreams of building a successful colony in Nicaragua were quickly shattered because a revolution broke out and they knew it was no longer safe for them. So they ended up relocating everyone back to Mexico and hoping for the best.
Give the wives their children and some money and just
Let
them go. What is the point of plural marriage if you're just constantly having your family in danger?
Yeah. So in 1974, one of the wives of Bud Chenoweth, who was part of Ervil's little band of brothers, he had a wife named Naomi, and she began speaking out against being part of this Ervil Lambs of God. She didn't like it. She didn't think what Ervil was doing was right. She was miserable and she regretted ever marrying Bud. And she would angrily tell people that she knew Ervil killed Joel. And she said, if he does anything else, I'm going to tell somebody. It got back to Ervil that Naomi was becoming a risk. And then he said he had a vision.
Oh, no.
That she needed to be silenced because she was going to stop the work of God. So in January of 1975, Ervil had 2 of his wives, Vonda White,
oh, no.
and Yolanda Rios. They picked up Naomi to take her for a ride. She wasn't suspicious. These were her friends. She thought they were just going out. They drove her into the mountains nearby, and at this point, they told her, get out of the car, and she knew something was wrong. Without warning, as soon as she got out of the car, Vonda shot her several times.
Whoa.
And then her sister wife, Yolanda, helped her lift Naomi's dead body into the trunk of their vehicle.
You did say that Vonda was kind of like Anna Mae's.
She was obsessed
number
with
2.
Ervil.
Okay.
They then drove her into an even more secluded area, and the 2 women dug a grave and tossed her body inside of it. When Vonda reported back to Ervil that the deed was done, he was overjoyed and stated, "You don't know how pleased the Lord is that traitor is dead." I don't know how old Naomi was. I'm guessing she was quite young.
And this is the 70s, right?
1974.
Women are finding their voices.
Yeah.
Especially if you're taking them from America to wherever your colony is. They've been exposed
to other ways
to
of life.
a lot of things now.
Naomi knew this wasn't right.
Right.
She's like, you just went and bombed a colony full of women and children. I don't want to be on this side, but she's married to this guy. She's just stuck in this marriage, and she got too vocal and they killed her. They're not going to stop. In February of 1975, Ervil decided he needed a 13th wife, and he set his sights on 16-year-old Rena Chenoweth. He had been after her since she was 14, and he had been proposing to her over the last 2 years, but she kept turning him down, and she had even written in her journals how he gave her the creeps. But Dan Jordan showed up and gave her an ultimatum and essentially said, if you don't marry Ervil, there will be consequences. And she felt like she had to marry him.
Yeah.
She might come up missing. Ervil was obsessed with killing Verlin. That was the next guy on his list. He needed to be blood atoned for taking his place as patriarch of the other church and for not bowing down to Ervil because Ervil was the true prophet. And he came up with what he thought was a foolproof plan. He wanted his men to go out and kill Verlin's mother-in-law. Her name was Rhea. And he said if she died, it was certain that Verlin would show up to attend her funeral. And when he was at the funeral, then they could kill Verlin. So it was April of 1975, and they set up a scheme. They had a woman call Rhea stating that she was trying to escape her traditional Mormon marriage and join the true believers in Mexico. They knew that Rhea was very loyal to her beliefs in polygamy and that she would love to help a woman out that wanted to move there. So the lady on the phone, pretending to be this woman in distress, asked her to meet at a gas station, and Rhea agreed to go. But she said as she was driving towards the location, she was overwhelmed with a feeling that something was off, and she turned around.
Good.
It's a good thing she did. If she had arrived at the gas station, one of Ervil's henchmen named Lloyd Sullivan was waiting in a car with a pistol to shoot her dead. Ironically, at the same time this was happening, Ervil is hiding out in Salt Lake City, and he's assuming that this is going to happen, and he starts telling all of his believers that he had received word from God directly that Rhea had died.
Oh, no.
his plan was being carried out just as he foretold. But Rhea was in fact alive, and she was back in Los Molinos, so this was a big embarrassment to Ervil because this was the second time he had been wrong. I don't know how, but people still kept following him. I don't even try to pretend to understand.
He's just bad at executing people, I guess.
The next victim of Ervil's blood atonement would be a man named Robert Simons, who believed that he was the one mighty and strong. So Robert had his own one-man cult going on. He lived in Utah, and he thought that he was brought about to be the one mighty and strong to deliver the Native Americans to salvation. So that was his whole idea.
Okay.
He owned a 65-acre ranch in Grantsville, Utah, and Ervil really wanted to get his hands on that land. Robert had also married a woman named Samantha McKinnon and her daughter, Linda. Ervil claimed that it was a sin to marry both a mother and a daughter, and he used scripture. He used this against Robert, and he actually approached Robert and said, "You are on the wrong path, but I'm the one true prophet, and I can forgive you for this if you join my church and you give me all of your land." He also wanted Robert's youngest wife, Linda.
Robert's like, "I don't need your forgiveness."
Robert was like,
shoo, fly away.
Exactly. How dare you have the audacity to show up at my door? I'm the one mighty and true or strong or whatever the fuck. How dare you show up and tell me I'm sinning? And no, I'm not going to give you my land, and you can't have my wife. Ervil was enraged that this guy didn't just bow down to him, and he told his followers that Robert needed to be blood atoned. He's a false prophet.
Now I'm just getting like the vibes of like Yellowstone.
Kind of, right?
You know?
So on April 23rd of 1975, Ervil sent his henchman again, Lloyd Sullivan. Lloyd showed up at Robert Simon's door pretending that he had defected from Ervil. And he said, "Once I met you, Robert, I knew that you were the one mighty and strong, and I want to follow you now."
Oh.
And he said, "Also, by the way, I am close with a Native American tribe. I want to take you to meet them so that they can know that you're the one, and we can deliver these Native Americans to heaven." And he falls for it, gets in the car, and they go out into the middle of nowhere again. And there were two other men lying in wait. When Robert got out of the car at what he thought was the place they were going to meet the Native Americans, these two men jumped out from behind some rocks and shot him.
Whoa.
The three men then dug a grave and buried his body, but not before taking his wallet, watch, and all that stuff.
You can't bury that with him.
They drove back to Utah, where Ervil was hiding in somebody's basement, and Ervil lavished praise on them for doing the Lord's work. One of the men that Ervil converted to his Lambs of God was named Dean Vest, and he was an ex-Navy man, and he actually came on board to help train those who worked with Ervil to be more military-like. He was doing some bad stuff. He had a wife named Emily, and she did not agree with what was going on, and she didn't like Ervil, and she gave Dean an ultimatum. "Leave Ervil and his church, or I'm going to divorce you and move back to Seattle with our daughter." Dean chose Ervil and let Emily go.
Well, at least he let her go and she didn't become a target.
True. But after a few months, he regretted his decision. He missed his wife. He missed his daughter. And he decided she was right. And he was going to leave Ervil's group and go to Seattle. But Ervil wasn't going to let him get away. He'd been training his people. You didn't leave Ervil's group if you were still useful to him. So Ervil told his 10th wife, Vonda White, that God had revealed that Dean needed to be blood atoned. And he gave her a pistol. Dean and Emily had been close with Vonda and her children, and they would often visit them. They lived in San Diego. So he thought nothing of it when he began his drive from Mexico to Seattle. Vonda offered to let him stay at her house on the way.
So Vonda is the girl that was living with another girl in California?
Yes. So she was living with Linda, who was the accountant.
Oh, okay.
Vonda and Linda ended up living together with their kids. If I remember right, Vonda, when he married her, she was already like in her 20s and had a career. So they were kind of like money makers for him. Dean stopped at Vonda's house on the way. And while there, she said, "I'm so glad you're here. I've been having problems with my washing machine."
Oh, no.
After he was done, she said, "Oh, you got some grease on your hands. You should use the kitchen sink." While he was there washing his hands in the sink, she pulled that pistol up, aimed it at the back of his head, and shot twice.
Oh.
She later confesses, "I was scared clear out of my wits, but I knew it was a command of God."
Well, you're kind of fucked up for it, though, because you had him fix something you needed fixed first.
Right. She used him. When he fell onto the kitchen floor, she shot him one more time to make sure he was dead. She then wiped the gun clean, placed it on Dean's body, and went upstairs to clean the blood off of herself. Then she called the police police and stated that she and the children had been upstairs and they just heard a gunshot. When police showed up, they quickly saw through her story. They saw small blood spots on her shoes, pants, and shirt.
She couldn't even change her
She's not very good.
clothes.
I mean, she's not a trained criminal, I guess. When asked about the blood, Vonda said, "Oh, yeah, Dean had a nosebleed earlier that I helped clean up."
They'd be able to see that in an autopsy quick.
So she was held as a suspect while lab techs tested the blood on her clothing, but it was too small of a sample. They couldn't connect it back.
What?
This is the 1970s. They also said there were no traces of gunpowder on her hands, so they didn't have anything to hold her there, and they had to let her go. As soon as she was let out of the jail or wherever they were holding her, Ervil sent his wife, Anna Mae, to get her and the children and move them into hiding in Colorado.
Why do things always come back to Colorado?
Yeah, they have places in California, Colorado, Texas, and Utah. Like when you watch the documentary, it's such a wild story and it's like spread out so much. I can't even get into all the details. It'd be a 5-parter to really do full justice to this story. He praised Vonda as being an elect lady to the kingdom of God. Ervil seemed to have no boundaries when it came to who he would blood atone. The most tragic case involved his own daughter, Rebecca. She had been given away against her will to marry Victor Chenoweth, one of his minions, at age 15. And Victor was, a good 30 years older. Victor had another wife. Her name was Nancy, and Rebecca was his second wife. Nancy did not like having a younger wife around, and she was horrible to Rebecca. When Rebecca gave birth to her first child, it was a boy. She named him Victor Jr., specifically to spite Nancy, who was just being a complete bitch to her all the time, because Nancy hadn't had a boy yet, and Rebecca knew that when she had a boy, she would want to name it Victor Jr., so she took that away from her. Victor didn't like Rebecca doing this, and he took Nancy's side. Together, they began abusing Rebecca.
Interesting. You'd think he'd want it.
Side with the 15-year-old girl.
And then having just a son named after him. It does seem weird.
She wanted to leave Victor, take her young son, and travel back to Mexico. They were in Colorado at the time. She just wanted to go back and live with her sisters. She also had just found out that she was pregnant with her second child, and she could not imagine continuing to live there with Nancy and Victor. But for whatever reason, Victor did not want her to leave. He didn't want her to take his only son. He actually kind of kidnapped her son and placed Victor Jr. in the care of his first wife, Nancy. Rebecca then threatened to report both Victor and her father, Ervil, to the authorities for what they were doing to her and what she knew they were doing to other people. She demanded to see her father in Dallas, but Victor got to Ervil first and told his side of the story. Ervil feared that his daughter would run to the cops, and he knew she knew too much about what was going on with the Lambs of God. And he told his stepson, Eddie, along with his brother-in-law, Dwayne Chenoweth, that she needed to be taken care of. She was sent to Dallas under the guise of meeting with her dad. Eddie and Dwayne met her and told her that her father had agreed to let her be free from the situation with Victor and that they would help her relocate to Mexico with her young son.
And they should, because he's the one that came up with the whole thing that if you felt like you were mistakenly wed or whatever to someone you didn't want to be with, you're allowed to leave. And
On his terms.
And he can't even grant that to his own daughter?
No. If he had just let her go to Mexico, she probably wouldn't have said anything to the authorities.
Right. She just wanted to be out of that house.
But Ervil's crazy, and he can't handle somebody standing up to him, especially not his own daughter, not a woman. So she's now several months pregnant. We're in April of 1977. And she is excited. She thinks everything's going to work out the way that she was hoping. So she's in the car thinking she's going to meet her dad. And instead, they drove her to the outskirts of Dallas into a very remote area. They pulled out a rope that they had hidden under the front seat of the car. They held her down and they strangled her to death.
I don't understand it. You give the girls guns, but you let the men do like this horrible way of dying for the woman?
I don't know how they chose. Maybe they didn't have enough guns to go around. Maybe you didn't trust these young boys with a gun. I'm not sure. So after they strangled her, they put her in the trunk of the car and they drove back to Ervil. And Ervil opened the trunk and looked at his dead daughter in the car.
Pregnant daughter.
Pregnant daughter. And he looked at the two boys and he praised them for their courage in following God's orders. He then instructed them to dispose of her body, drive into Oklahoma to take care of it. When they returned, Ervil complained about how dirty his trunk in his car was. He showed absolutely no remorse for the death of his young daughter. He was actually angry at the boys at this point. He said they had been sloppy, and he worried that the car could be traced back to him. He ended up selling the vehicle and replacing it with another one that was the same make, year, and color. Only days after Rebecca's murder, Ervil was already plotting his next blood atonement. He's getting sick with power. He's a serial killer. He's not physically killing anyone, but he's getting off on this.
Yeah.
He gathered several of his followers in his home and unveiled his new plan to kill his brother Verlin. It's actually kind of an old plan.
It's a revamped plan.
He's tried it twice and he's failed. So this time, his plan is that they would lure Verlin to another funeral. Originally, it was his mother-in-law. This time, the funeral would be that of Rulon Allred, the leader of the other main fundamentalist sect with the thousands of followers that Ervil has been jealous of forever. They would have to kill Rulon Allred, which he had it coming. He was a false prophet, and there's no way Verlin would not attend the funeral. So one death would lead to the other. It's a domino effect. So Ervil plotted that there would need to be 3 teams to accomplish this mission. The first team would kill Dr. Rulon Allred in Salt Lake City. Rulon Allred was a chiropractor. They would kill him and then escape the state. The second group would wait for his funeral where they would stalk and kill Verlin. And if for whatever reason Verlin was not killed at the funeral, there would be a third team waiting in El Paso, Texas, which they knew Verlin traveled there often. One of his wives lived there, and they would get him there instead. It's going to make sure that there's some fallback since the other 2 plans had failed.
Hi.
Ervil explained that he wanted women to handle the hit on Dr. Allred. So he chose his newest wife, Rena Chenoweth. She is only 16 years old.
Jeez.
And Ramona Marston, who was one of Dan Jordan's wives. She was also very young. I'm not real sure of her age. She wasn't a minor, though. I think she was maybe 20.
Okay.
So on May 10th of 1977, around 4:30 p.m., Rena and Ramona entered Rulon's chiropractic office. Rena was carrying a .25 automatic pistol, and Ramona had a .38 revolver. Both women were disguised with wigs and heavy coats, which seems odd. It was May, and they're wearing heavy coats.
We have snow in May here.
True.
And this is Utah. They probably do too.
There were 3 patients waiting in the front office. Ramona sat down next to one of them while Rena just proceeded into the hallway where the examination rooms were. Rulon came out of one of the rooms and entered a lab area. As he turned to face Rena, she recognized that he was Verlin. She drew the gun out of her coat pocket and fired at him. She shot him 7 times. He fell to the floor, and then Ramona in the waiting room stood up with her gun, pulled it out just to be ready. Rena walked back into the waiting room. The patients are freaking out that are sitting there what just happened? And the 2 women left the building. 10 seconds later, Rena comes back into the building, goes up to Rulon's body, and was going to fire one more shot because they had been taught by the training with the military guy to always deliver one final blow.
Interesting.
The 2 girls then left in a Ford pickup that had been stolen. Isn't stealing against...
Yeah, it doesn't matter. They're not following anything anymore. Yeah. It's just...
He makes up his own rules.
It's anything that he says.
Rulon was a very respected man in Salt Lake City. Even though he had his polygamy stuff going on, he was still in favor somehow with the LDS church. He had a very large funeral.
It is getting crazy with the murders coming into everything now. This is totally a movie.
It feels like The Mob. It feels like Goodfellas or something.
I forget we're talking about religion at all. Well, just a religion. Feels like a bunch of gangs.
That's why when I watched that documentary, I was like, this is insane. I have to talk about this. So Verlin did want to travel to Utah to pay his respects to Rulon, but he alerted the authorities the day before and let them know that he felt like something might happen. He knew his brother was behind Rulon's murder, even though they had not proven it yet. He just knew. The police believed him, and they dispatched 9 police cars, and there were several policemen staking outside and inside the funeral home and church. Ervil had sent Don Sullivan, Eddie Marston, and Jack Chenoweth as his henchmen to be Act 2, where they were supposed to take out Verlin at the funeral. But when they drove up and saw all the police there, they got nervous. They realized it would be impossible to take out Verlin with so many people and police around to witness. They felt really conflicted. They were driving back to Dallas to tell Ervil, and they were nervous that he would kill them because they hadn't followed through with his prophecy.
Right.
The other team was set up in El Paso, and they were staying there, but Verlin never showed up, so they were unable to kill him there. So his plan failed again. And while these men were out risking their lives, what they didn't know, Ervil was gone. He had already fled the country. He's a fucking coward. He was hiding in Mexico just in case anything went wrong.
Okay.
He didn't want it to be connected to him.
Of course it's connected to you.
Everybody knows, dude. You've written like books about this shit. Come on. So after Rulon's death, many of the members of the Church of the Firstborn and Rulon's sect, the Apostolic Brethren or something,
yes,
they were all afraid at this point. They knew that Ervil was unhinged and could come after anyone. Delphina, who was the mother of Rebecca, the daughter that Ervil had killed, she had been really close to Rebecca, and she had been so upset when her daughter had been sent to be married to Victor and moved to Colorado.
She doesn't know she's dead.
No. And she begins begging Ervil to let her go see her daughter. She's missing her baby.
Yeah.
And she was also worried because after her daughter had left, she had been writing her mother and they had been in constant contact, and she hadn't heard from Rebecca in a while. She kept asking Ervil, and he realized his wife wasn't going to stop asking. So he fabricated this story and said, actually, Rebecca ran off with some lover she met and she's back in Mexico, but I don't know where she is. Delphina knew her daughter well, and she knew her daughter would not have run off with some random guy. So she got on a bus and she traveled to Texas, where her daughter was supposedly living with Victor.
Oh, okay.
And while there, she saw her daughter Lillian, who had also been married off to the other Chenoweth brother, Mark. And this is when Lillian said, Mom, don't ask questions. She knew something had happened to Rebecca too. She hadn't heard from Rebecca in a while, but she knew that Ervil's team was crazy, that their father was doing all this blood atonement. And she told her mom, you better play along or you're going to end up getting hurt. Delphina took her daughter's advice, and she actually told Ervil she had come to Texas because she wanted to recommit to the Lambs of God, and she let him rebaptize her into the church. And she thought it was working. But then out of the blue one day, Mark Chenoweth came to Delphina and said, I want to take you to a movie. We'll go meet up with Lillian. But it was just him, and she felt like it was a trap.
Yeah.
And so she fled. She went to the bus stop with her youngest children. She intended to travel back to Mexico. But before getting on the bus, she called her mother in San Diego. Her mom happened to be sitting at a table when she called with the police.
Oh, wow.
They had stopped by to talk with the mother-in-law of Ervil because they were on the trail and trying to find him.
Right.
Her mom put her on the phone with police. She told them she was worried for the lives of herself and her children, and they flew her from Texas to California and put her and her children into witness protection.
That's amazing.
This is great. This is a good part of the story. 2 of Delphina's sons, Isaac and Pablo, were put into witness protection, and they had actually been working for Ervil for a while because I don't feel like they had a choice. It was their dad.
Yeah.
And they had been part of that raid on Los Molinos. And now that they felt safe, they gave information about that raid and the fact that Ervil had ordered it to the police and the FBI.
Good.
And this event alone would be what ultimately leads to the arrest of Ervil LeBaron again. He was being hunted by the FBI. One of Ervil's main henchmen, I mentioned before, Lloyd Sullivan, he had been along for the ride on several of the killings. It was early 1978, and he started to, I guess, question things, and he reached out to Verlin via letter, and he said that he wanted to leave Ervil's church and he wished to repent. He asked Verlin if he would meet him in person so he could ask for his forgiveness and blessing. This seems like a setup, and Verlin thought
that's what
it's probably a setup.
Yeah.
But he also, in the back of his mind, was like, maybe it's sincere, but he's not dumb. He agreed he would meet with Lloyd, but he contacted the Utah FBI and the Salt Lake City police before doing so.
Smart.
So they accompanied him as undercover agents when he went to meet Lloyd in a hotel. It actually turns out Lloyd was sincere. And he wanted to get the hell out of Ervil's crazy Lambs of God. He provided a full confession to Verlin and said he would cooperate with the police to bring Ervil down. Lloyd was able to confirm the plot around killing Verlin at Rulon's funeral, and also to prove his loyalty, he told them that he had actually killed Robert Simons on behalf of Ervil in Utah. He led the police to where the body was buried. So they have evidence now.
Yes, they do. He's also giving up his life and admitting that.
Shortly after this confession, the police raided a house in Denver, Colorado, hoping to find Ervil hiding there. He was not there, but they found Vonda, and they were able to arrest her based on Lloyd's confession of her killing Dean Vest, because Lloyd told the police everything.
Good. She needs arrested. She's killed too now.
Yeah, I don't think I can have a lot of sympathy for her.
Not for her. It feels
she
like
seemed pretty cold-blooded.
It's not like she's bombarded by him on a daily basis. She doesn't even live with the man.
No.
This is her own obsession, her own mental stuff, whatever. She cold-blooded killed 2 people.
In my mind, when I look at the 13 wives of Ervil, Anna Mae and Vonda White were just as psychopathic as he was, honestly. Vonda killed another young girl.
Yeah.
That takes a certain level.
Yes.
So on April 24th of 1978, she appeared in San Diego for the murder of Dean. Lloyd was going to be the star witness, but he was super paranoid that he was going to be blood atoned before the trial. So the police did record all of his confessions for everything. He knew everything. And it's really good that they did, because
oh no,
Lloyd was not blood atoned, but he did die of a heart attack just out of the blue. He's probably so stressed about being blood atoned.
Seriously, I mean, you're a part of something enough for you to go kill somebody, and now you've turned yourself in and you're doing all this. It's a crisis of your life in that moment.
He probably wasn't sleeping. I can't imagine. He had confessed everything on video before he died, so thank God he did. So Vonda White, I'm just going to go through this now and get her out of the way. She did end up going through 2 trials. The first one was dismissed on a technicality, but her second one on May 13th, 1979, she was found guilty of murder and she was sentenced to life in prison. She was only brought up for murder against Dean, but remember, she also killed Naomi. But Naomi never came up. It didn't matter. She still got life in prison. She served that time. She's still serving it today. And Vonda has never given up on her belief in Ervil being the one true prophet.
Okay.
So
wow.
She's gone.
Yeah.
She would encourage her children, and probably still does to this day from behind bars, to stay true to Ervil and loyal to the Lambs of God. Just a few weeks later, after Vonda was brought in, police finally caught up to Ervil LeBaron. He was found hiding out in a small town south of Mexico City with his wife, Lorna. Mexican authorities extradited them immediately back to the United States and into the hands of the FBI. On June 1st, 1979, Ervil was arrested and booked into the Webb County Jail in Laredo, Texas, with bail set at $100,000. While in Laredo, detectives held several interviews with Ervil. At first, he remained pretty silent, only answering questions with yes or no. But finally, he couldn't help himself, and he had to start spewing the stuff he always did.
Of course.
He admitted that he was the prophet and leader of the Church of the Lambs of God. He also declared himself the anointed one who would bring about the millennium, bragging that he was the only person on earth designated to lead God's kingdom and prepare for a worthy people to meet Christ at his second coming. They said at one point Ervil rose from his chair to let them know, I have even more to tell you. They said he rambled on for hours, explaining his religious beliefs, and the detectives were just sitting there taking notes and recording his speeches as he droned on and on.
All right, now I understand the Manson stuff too. I mean, it made sense before, but this is a total Manson moment.
Yeah, totally. They said it seemed like he was reveling in having a captive audience where he could show off all his knowledge of the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
He made it clear that he was the head of every government all over the world, and that every president or leader who didn't subject themselves to his authority was a criminal.
And I will kill them.
And deserve to be blood atoned. He mentioned Jimmy Carter, who was the U.S. president, and the Pope in Rome.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
So his trial would take place in Salt Lake City in May of 1980. He was being tried for the murder of Rulon Allred. He could not afford any lawyers, so he ended up using court-appointed defense attorneys.
What about Joel?
He wasn't brought on charges for Joel. Joel was also killed in Mexico. Rulon was killed in Utah, so maybe it's a jurisdiction thing.
Well, sure.
The prosecution called 43 witnesses to the stand, and they all confessed that even though Ervil was never at the murder scene, no one would have committed the assassination without his orders.
Of course.
The evidence was overwhelming. On May 28th, the jury only deliberated for 3 hours before coming out and returning a guilty verdict of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison and incarcerated on June 2nd, 1980 in the Utah State Prison, Point of the Mountain. Everyone hoped that his imprisonment would end the bloodshed, but unfortunately, it did not.
Like I said before, what did I say?
They have more time.
They get more time, and he can do shit from prison.
And that's what he's going to do. While in prison, Ervil LeBaron wrote a manifesto titled The Book of the New Covenants. which was printed and distributed to all of his members. In this book, he listed approximately 50 people who needed to be blood atoned.
Oh my God.
Ervil also ordained his son Arturo LeBaron to be his successor, and he ordained another 6 sons to serve as high priests to perpetuate the lambs of God and continue on with the blood atonement killings.
Oh, wow.
A little more than 1 year later, on August 16th, 1981, Ervil LeBaron was found dead in his cell. Some sources say he died of a heart attack and others say it was suicide, so I'm not sure which one is the truth. But he was finally dead and he could not continue to spew hateful prophecies.
But this was after he did his manifesto.
He already wrote it with 50 names.
And his sons are going to
try and
vindicate him and blah, blah, blah.
So it's going to keep going.
And then it goes on and on and on.
Sadly, just 2 days after Ervil died, Verlin was killed in a head-on collision in Mexico. Just random.
His sons.
They've never proven it. Irene mentions in her book, she wonders.
Well, yeah, I would assume so. That's too much of a coincidence. Or God is really angry and he's like, just get rid of them.
Get rid of all the LeBarons.
This was a big mistake.
So just like that, 2 men that were leading like some of the most powerful fundamentalist sects were gone.
Yeah.
So much for the LeBaron prophecy.
I don't know. They're still around.
As for those who killed on behalf of Ervil, I will mention his young wife, Rena Chenoweth. She was the one that actually shot Rulon 7 times, but she was under the age of 18 when she did that, and she was acquitted by the court. She appeared on Sally, Jesse, Raphael. You remember that show?
Mm-hmm.
In the 1990s. And on that show, she admitted that she killed him. She said she thought it was being done in the name of the Lord, and she also said she was frightened that if she didn't do it, Ervil would have done it to her. So
yeah.
I feel bad for her. She was young. She didn't want to marry the guy to begin with.
Right.
Ramona, the other young accomplice in Rulon's murder, surrendered to the authorities. She did not receive any jail time. She was just put on probation.
Yeah. And she didn't shoot at all. She was just there.
She was just there. Dan Jordan, Lloyd Sullivan, and the Rios brothers, and some of the others that I mentioned that we know killed on behalf of Ervil, were never apprehended and they never received any jail time.
Wow.
So really, it was just Ervil and his crazy wife, Vonda, that went down for the murders. I'll remind you that before Ervil's death, there were 8 people killed. So it was Joel LeBaron, Edmundo Aguilar, and Maroni Mendez were the 2 boys killed in the Los Molinos raid.
Mm-hmm.
Naomi Zarate, Robert Simons, Dean Vest, his daughter Rebecca LeBaron, and then Rulon Allred. But that wouldn't be the end. After Ervil's death, his son Arturo stepped up to take on the crown of patriarch and the one mighty and strong. Arturo was also the son of Delfina, and remember, Delfina was the one.
Oh, wow.
Like, I feel bad for this woman because she was the first wife, so she had the oldest children.
Yeah.
And he used all of them.
And she got away, thankfully.
Under Arturo, the cult openly began embracing the criminal enterprises. This is when we will see them get involved with the cartel. They specifically got involved with auto theft because that was a big thing in Mexico at the time. We're now into the 1980s and they were taking cars and doing chop shop and all of that.
Right.
Ervil's wife, Lorna Chenoweth, I can't remember what number wife she was. She was still living down there even after Ervil's death, and she became disillusioned. She didn't want to follow Arturo, and she decided she was going to leave the Lambs of God, and Arturo ordered that she be executed or blood atoned, and she was killed by her own son, Andrew.
Oh, that is so messed up.
I am not going to go into a lot of detail, but the sons of Ervil could be a whole episode on their own. They're pretty evil.
They sound it.
Another of Ervil's followers, his name was Leo Ivanik. He decided he should have the authority, and after months of arguing with Arturo, the men agreed that they were going to sit down and resolve their differences. And at that meeting, Gamaliel and Raul Rios, who had worked for Ervil, they were now on the side of Leo, and they showed up and they murdered Arturo.
Oh, I didn't see that coming.
This is why I'm like, this could be a whole episode.
I thought it was going to be the other way around.
No, it becomes like this whole mafia thing. Like everybody's killing everybody. You can't trust anybody. Rena Chenoweth, at this point, after Arturo was killed, she moves away with her children. She's like, I'm getting the fuck out of here. The Chenoweth brothers, Mark and Dwayne, and their mother, Thelma, who had been obsessed with Ervil, they also moved and left. Like a lot of people started defecting away. They were like, this is too much for me. Dan Jordan, who was his right-hand man, moved his family to Utah. And sadly, 3 of Ervil's children, 1 son and 2 daughters, would end up committing suicide. So after Arturo was murdered, leadership of the cult, that's what I'm going to call it now, fell to the next son on Ervil's list, and his name was Ervil LeBaron, and he was 20 years old.
This is a whole new generation. Who knows what comes of that?
And Ervil was described as being just viciously evil. A lot of people would die after he became the leader, the one mighty and true, whatever, because he pulled out that book and he said, we're going through this one by one. And he started killing those who he blamed for Arturo's death. So Gamaliel and Raul Rios were the first ones killed. Their two sisters, Yolanda and Teresa, just disappeared. So we assume they were killed as well.
Oh my God.
He accused them of knowing that their brothers were coming to murder his brother Arturo. And then he killed Leo Ivanic, who was the one that killed Arturo. Heber did not spend any time in the pulpit. He was not a religious follower, but he fully embraced plural marriage, and he used that to his advantage, much like his brother did.
I don't see any religion here anymore. It's just it's just a gang with a leader and
it keeps
a set of mafia roles that are there.
I feel like it keeps spiraling down. Heber was known to just keep collecting wives, and he got to the point where there weren't any left, and he started marrying his half-sisters and stepsisters.
Oh, okay.
And it was said that in order to stay in tight with the cartel and the criminal enterprises, he began pimping out his sisters and even his own wives. Heber's like a whole nother level even than Ervil.
There's no one there to rein him in.
No, there isn't. And I don't know that they would have really known any of the basis of the religion. They only knew, I guess, their father's darker side, the Lambs of God. They didn't grow up in like the nicer church, like with Rulon or Joel even. They grew up with their angry, spiteful
chaotic,
dad.
jumping from place to place, blood atonement, multiple wives. I need money. Follow me. If you don't, you're dead. Dad.
Right. And they would end up splitting into two, Heber and his younger brother Aaron. And some of them would come to the United States to establish a part of the criminal enterprise to send cars back down to Mexico. And they started this huge auto theft ring. So like you said, there's no religion involved at this point.
No.
And in August of 1987, Aaron, the younger brother, showed up at Dan Jordan's home saying that he was afraid of his brother Heber and he was just asking for shelter and sanctuary. Dan didn't really know if he should trust Aaron, but he allowed them to move in. He thought they maybe were just in need. He had heard how horrible Heber had become. 2 months later, Dan Jordan would take his wives and children and he would invite Ervil LeBaron and his children to come along on the camping trip. And they had been lying in wait just for a chance to get at Dan Jordan. Remember, Dan Jordan's the second in command to Ervil. Dan's name had been on this list of blood atonement, which I don't understand because he was Ervil's. They went camping here and they waited until basically Dan went out to pee in the middle of the night and they shot him in the back of the head and killed him.
Yeah, I don't understand that one. Unless just in the end when Ervil was in trial or something went down. He didn't feel like he had his back.
He may have testified against him. I just know he never went to jail, so he must have given something to the cops so that he could continue to live.
Yeah.
It would continue to go on and on. Mark Chenoweth, Dwayne Chenoweth, like basically all of the people that had followed under Ervil ended up dead through his sons. One brother would get killed and a new one would take over, and it just went on and on and on. There's a lot of LeBarons.
It's insane.
It's estimated that of the 50 people on the list that Ervil put in that manifesto, 25 died.
Okay. Well, that's a lot.
Many of the others that knew they were on that list went into hiding or witness protection because they were afraid, and they should be.
Yeah, because they're effective at killing off people.
Yes, it's what they were taught to do. In the documentary that I watched, there are several sisters and brothers on that show, and they talk about how absolutely heartbroken they were when they saw their like step siblings or siblings, Heber and Aaron and Arturo, turn into these madmen.
Yeah.
And many of them escaped. I just wanted to wrap it up by reading a quote from Anna LeBaron. In her book, she said, "It's been over 40 years since I escaped my father's cult. To be able to grow and become the person that I am today, to heal enough that I was able to write my own story and to publish my book. I want to be an inspiration to others. Anyone who's experienced abuse, neglect, abandonment, those things don't have to define you. I have overcome the odds, and I am here to tell others that they can too."
What a rough life.
Today, there are estimated to be 50 to 100,000 people who are still practicing polygamists throughout the Western U.S., Canada, and Mexico. I tried to look up how many sects there still are. I know that the United Apostolic Brethren is still considered the largest, the one started by Rulon Allred. There are people practicing polygamy in secret. They are following what Joseph Smith and Brigham Young started in the 1800s. They feel like they are living the principle.
Right.
Most of them are not doing what Ervil LeBaron did, fortunately. But the LeBarons are still down in Mexico. Colonial LeBarons still exists today. One of the final books that I read is a story of something that happened within the last 7 years. And what is happening down there is that the cartel and the Lambs of God, which they're still called today, got really intertwined. They had this like agreement that they wouldn't mess with each other, but it's not being followed. And just recently, there were several young women and children that were on their way between Colonial LeBaron and Los Molinos, were caught up in some kind of gunfire and killed by the cartel.
Oh boy.
I didn't have time to go into all of that, but just know that like the violence that was started by Ervil LeBaron, his descendants are feeling the ramifications to this day.
Well, it's worse now. It feels like it's a daily thing that they're living with, and it's not so much a don't piss off Ervil, it's don't do anything at all.
And they got in bed with the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
And they're right outside of Juarez. It's a dangerous part.
Yeah, sadly it's dangerous.
But they did interviews with the women that are living there today, and it's really scary and sad because a lot of them believe in whoever the prophet is today. I don't even know who it is. It just continues, and I don't know how you break that.
I don't know how. You try to have conversations with people
and they don't realize it until they get out, and you'll hear that if you watch the documentary. They didn't know they were in a cult. This was their life.
That was their life.
This was their family.
Especially if you were born into it.
Yeah, and all of these poor children were.
And a lot of even kids who are born into cults though know something is wrong, because inherently you're like, this, I'm not supposed to be treated this way. I'm not supposed to be scared for my life every day. It's good, but it is scary for the ones that just never wake up to it.
Right. And they just perpetuate it.
Because
and that's why the cycle continues.
No.
And if you are a LeBaron, you feel like you are part of that lineage that has to carry it on. That's a lot of pressure on these young boys specifically. And, even the girls, they feel like they have to marry. Heber was marrying his own stepsisters. I mean, it got really, really messed up down there. Not that it wasn't when Ervil was there. Once again, this is a story of how dangerous things can get from what may have started out as an innocent religion. If you think back to the original Mormons and what we talked about in part 1, they were doing some shady shit, but who would have ever thought it would have ended up where it did?
But that was like the 1800s. They had an opportunity. Once the U.S. was like, no more extra wives for you.
Yes.
They had an opportunity to live more civil lives, and they turned it into something else completely that then led to murder and all of this stuff. And I understand that it might have been based on Joseph Smith, or I guess it was more Brigham Young at the time. But we're talking about the 1800s. People were killing each other left and right. So things were a little bit different back then. People now don't live in the same world as the 1800s. And different circumstances.
We don't live the same way as the people in the Bible did.
Exactly.
It's a different world now. You cannot use these ancient books and apply them to today.
Nope.
It's dangerous.
It is very dangerous.
And that, to me, is the lesson that you learn from a story like this.
Because these are stories written by men, whether you want to call them prophets or not, of their time.
Right. And religion fits and is written within whatever the constraints of the society are at the time that it's created. It needs to be modified if you're going to keep bringing it into the future.
It's been modified so much. If it was meant to say something about us, then the Bible would have predictions that was written in the 1800s of all of our modern day shit right now.
If God knows everything.
And not in some way that needs to be deciphered.
All I know is if this is the one all-knowing God, like you said, he would know what it was, and he would have written it very clearly. If this book was inspired, any book, Book of Mormon, Bible, the Quran, all of that, it wouldn't be hard to understand.
It would
be clear as day. But you know what I think is clear as day from the Bible? Love one another.
Yes.
Love thy neighbor. Take care of the poor. I don't know. I can't quote scriptures because I'm not a Bible person anymore.
Be a good person.
Exactly.
It's not that hard. Be a good person.
There are a lot of good verses. Why is anyone who's religious using all the judgmental verses instead? Why aren't we focused on the good parts? Because every holy book out there has very good, loving messages, but we don't focus on those.
Nope.
And neither did the LeBarons or Ervil specifically. What I feel like I took away from all the time I've spent in the Mormon religion is that it has a lot of good points, just like I mentioned with all the different holy books having good parts. If Joseph Smith had not wanted to, let's be honest, sleep with his maid in his house, I don't think the whole concept of polygamy would have been part of the plan. I think it was something that was done in a defense mechanism. It became
a desired thing to have.
And it spiraled out of control.
Sure
and
did.
What led to all of this crazy bullshit I just read about these people enslaving all these women down in Mexico, because that's what it was, keeping them pregnant. And then Ervil LeBaron and all these people climbing to the top thinking that they were number one. It led to Brigham Young coming up with this whole blood atonement thing to defend his 50-something wives. Like, it's just like this whole, I don't want to say butterfly effect. It's just like this.
Oh, yeah, it's
one thing leads to another bullshit.
Yeah, I think without polygamy and then what Brigham Young brought into it, Mormonism might have been a very attractive religion to grow to the expanse that he imagined.
Yeah. You're right.
Because it has a lot of points to it that are attractive to people coming from other religions where there is a massive focus on hell and all this.
It was a much more positive story.
Yeah, it is. It sucks to see it thrown to the wind and become murder.
Right.
I mean, it's just a crazy story. And yeah, I think at the end, when it comes to that particular group, it has nothing to do with religion
they're way
anymore.
So far away.
But it came from the origin of what you showed us. I didn't know all of that. You know, I grew up in the church. Obviously, they're going to not tell us everything.
No, they're going to hide the ugly parts.
And I've actually, since us recording the last episode, talked to a few people who also grew up in the church. And I said, were you told this? And were you told this? And they're like, no, they're no longer practicing in the church, but they're not critical. They're like me, and they were much more involved than I was.
Right.
So hearing that coming from them, I was like, whoa. Mm-hmm. Listening to the beginnings of everything that led up to these psychotic people. Right. Yes.
When you start marrying too many first cousins.
Yes. There's going to be some defects.
Undesirable traits pass forward.
Right.
And unfortunately, the LeBarons had some mental things that manifested quite well in Ervil and his sons. I think the Mormon Manson is a accurate name for what he did.
Yes, I agree.
I'm surprised this story's not out there more.
Me too, because he's worse than Manson in a way.
He had people killing full on thinking, I don't know, remember Manson's story. Was it a religion thing?
In a way, it's spiritualism and following him, and they did drugs, and he had these wild out there moments telling them what to do, and he was the whatever.
But they weren't threatened with like, do this or you're going to burn in hell. Eventually, maybe we'll cover Manson. It's one we've strayed away from because everybody does it.
Well, everybody does it, but Manson is connected to so many other cults.
Yeah.
So many cults have come from Manson, or even Manson came from another cult. There's a lot of connections.
And you saw how much I had to do just to get to Ervil LeBaron, because there's so much history behind everything. The truth of the matter is the LeBaron sons are still out there, or grandsons at this point. I don't really know where they're at. It could continue and more cults could pop up from this one guy. And it really started with the guy who gave Joseph Smith enemas. Benjamin Johnson.
Which is crazy. And now where it's at, I don't know why, but the future of the LeBarons is Mad Max.
They're pretty close.
You know what I'm saying?
That's what I picture their colonial LeBaron looks like today. They do have cell phones down there now.
Oh, good.
They do have electricity and running water at this point. So it is a better life.
Although in the 70s, they still didn't, which is crazy.
People will endure the craziest circumstances when they think that they're on the right path to enlightenment or to be saved from the end of the world, or Jesus Christ is coming, or whatever they tell you, just like Heaven's Gate.
Right.
When we talked about that.
Right. Meeting aliens.
Exactly.
Apple White.
They'll live in, weren't they like crammed into houses? I can't even remember
a big mansion at some point, but they were all over the place.
And Jack Parsons with the whole Thelema.
Right.
Whatever, their crazy living situations. And then that morphed into Scientology, which I don't even understand, but
it's easy to follow someone who is inspirational to you. Don't take it so far that you move to another country for them.
And if you're thinking of pulling a gun towards somebody else that you don't have anything against personally, you might be in a cult.
There's a lot of you might be in a cult moments throughout this. Thank you for doing a lot of research for this, Kendra.
And I'm sorry it's going to be very long.
I anticipated this one for a long time, and we did it.
I hope you guys guys enjoyed hearing the history and the story of the LeBaron cults. I don't know that we'll go to any other Mormon cults for a while.
No, we're going to stay away from it.
We're going to take off now and have a couple glasses of wine and decompress. So thank you for listening. Please check us out on our social medias, all at Lucid Lab Podcast, one word. We're on TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram.
Please send in your lab reports or your mini episode or long episode suggestions to lucidlabpodcast@gmail.com.
And remember, when somebody stands up and says they are the one mighty and strong, and you've already heard that from like 12 other people, they're probably not it.
And the whole time you said that, all I thought of was the Mighty Ducks. The movie would flash in front of my eyes every time.
Every time I said the one mighty and strong.
Yeah. Anyway, guys, come back. We will be releasing next Tuesday with my episode, and I won't tell you what it is yet, but it
You never reveal.
involves some ice cream.
Who doesn't like some ice cream?
Not this ice cream.
Deadly ice cream.
In the meantime,
Stay lucid.
watch out for Mormons in Mexico. Adios.
Bye.